Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. Tonight's story is another long one, so let yourself settle in properly, get truly comfortable before we begin. On the 1st of August in the year 1589, at a modest royal residence at Saint-Cloud on the western edge of Paris, a young Dominican friar named Jacques Clément, carrying a letter he claimed was meant for the king's own eyes alone, was shown into the presence of King Henry III of France, the last surviving son of the House of Valois, a dynasty that had worn the crown of France for over 2.5 centuries. Henry, seated and unwell, reached to receive the letter. Clément produced instead a long dagger hidden in his own sleeve and drove it into the king's own abdomen. Henry survived the initial wound long enough to have his own attendants seize and kill the friar where he stood, and long enough, in the confused and painful hours that followed, to do the one thing this entire story tonight actually depends on, which is to formally and publicly confirm from his own deathbed that his own throne and the crown of France itself would pass not to any remaining Valois cousin, because there were none left close enough in blood to inherit it, but to a distant kinsman, a Protestant king of a small mountain kingdom in the Pyrenees, a man named Henry of Navarre, whom a great many of Henry's own Catholic subjects regarded, at that exact hour, as scarcely more acceptable a king than the assassin's own dagger had been. Henry III died the following morning, and with his own death, the House of Valois, which had ruled France since the year 1328, ended, and the House of Bourbon, a cadet branch of the old royal family so distant and so long overlooked that its own senior line had, only 66 years before, actually committed outright treason against the crown it was now about to inherit, became, in the person of a battle-scarred Protestant king with no army capable of actually taking his own capital city, the reigning royal house of France. We are not going to rush toward the wider and considerably longer story this whole night is actually about, tempting as it is to leap straight to the Palace of Versailles, or to the moment a Bourbon prince first sat on the throne of Spain, or to the 4 separate crowns this same family would eventually gather onto 4 separate heads across a single Mediterranean and Atlantic world, because none of it, not the Sun King's own gardens, not the double monarchy of France and Spain, not the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily and Parma, this family would eventually rule as casually as a merchant might divide a modest inheritance among several sons, makes any real sense unless we first understand exactly how improbable, how contingent, and how many separate times, over an accident of death without an heir actually was, that this same family survived at all. This is a story, in other words, about a river, a single, narrow, unremarkable spring, rising in an obscure and frequently overlooked corner of French genealogy, that found itself, across 3 centuries and against every reasonable expectation anyone alive at its own source could possibly have held, forking and forking again, crossing mountain ranges and stretches of open sea until it watered. By the middle years of the 1700s, the throne rooms of Paris and Madrid and Naples and Parma all at once, becoming in the process the most extensive and the most consequential accumulation of royal power the whole of Europe had seen since the age of Charlemagne. Let us say the thesis plainly, here at the very beginning, the way we like to on this channel, so you know the shape of the long night ahead of you. This is a story about how little of any dynasty's own eventual grandeur was ever actually planned. At the moment it was being lived by the people living through it. It is a story about a family that spent nearly 3 centuries as a genealogical afterthought, a spare branch kept alive mostly by the accident that closer and grander branches kept, one after another running out of sons, and it is a story about what that same family did, generation after generation, once fortune finally handed it, the one thing every noble house of this era actually wanted and almost none of them ever received in such extravagant abundance, which was not merely one throne, but several, gathered up not through any single master plan drawn up in advance, but through a long, uneven, often desperate accumulation of marriages, treaties, wars, and the ordinary biological misfortune of other royal houses, failing again and again to produce the one thing dynastic survival has always actually depended on: a living, legitimate male heir. Before we drift into the rest of this story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night, and there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, settle in for a long and unhurried night, and let yourself ease into the story of the House of Bourbon, a family that began this whole tale as the poor relations of French royalty, distant enough from the throne that nobody, for nearly 300 years, seriously imagined they would ever wear a crown at all, and that ended it, 150 years and 4 generations later, ruling more of Europe, more directly, than any single royal house had managed to rule in over 8 centuries. A younger son's younger son, and a title carved out of leftover land. To understand how the House of Bourbon eventually came to hold the crown of France at all, we have to go back nearly 3.5 centuries before Jacques Clément ever raised his own dagger at Saint-Cloud, to the reign of Louis IX, the king the French would one day canonize as Saint Louis, and to the 6 sons that pious and famously devout monarch left behind him at his own death in 1270. It is worth pausing here, at the very outset, on how ordinary and how unremarkable the specific arrangement actually was that eventually produced the House of Bourbon, because Louis's own throne passed, by the ordinary and uncontested logic of primogeniture, to his own eldest surviving son, Philip III, while the younger sons of the royal house were customarily granted lesser titles, lesser estates, and a rank in the kingdom's own nobility considerably beneath the crown itself, a settlement each of those younger sons was generally expected to accept without complaint, since the alternative, a kingdom repeatedly divided among competing brothers, was exactly the kind of dynastic instability the French crown had spent the preceding 2 centuries trying to avoid. It is worth pausing specifically on Louis's own 6th son, a boy named Robert, born in 1256 and given, as his own share of his father's legacy, the county of Clermont-en-Beauvaisis, a comparatively modest inheritance for the son of a canonized king, and it is worth pausing too on the marriage that actually transformed Robert of Clermont's own family from a minor committal line into the house that would eventually give its own name to the entire dynasty, because Robert married, in 1272, a noble woman named Beatrice, heiress in her own right to the lordship of Bourbon, a substantial and comparatively wealthy territory in central France that had been held for generations by an entirely separate noble family before passing, through Beatrice's own inheritance, into Robert's own hands. It was Robert and Beatrice's own son, Louis I, who would eventually see his own family's combined holdings elevated in 1327 into a full duchy, the Duchy of Bourbon, by his own first cousin, King Charles IV, an elevation that gave the family its own permanent name and its own permanent place among the great feudal houses of France. But that also, and this is worth naming plainly here at the very start of this whole long genealogical story, placed the family several full generations and several full branches removed from any realistic prospect of the French crown itself, a cadet line among cadet lines, prosperous and well regarded but genuinely peripheral to the actual business of who would someday rule France. It is worth pausing too on how thoroughly this same peripheral status appeared to be confirmed, rather than challenged, across the 2 centuries that followed the duchy's own creation, because the House of Bourbon spent the whole of the 1300s and the whole of the 1400s as exactly what its own founding charter had made it, a great noble house, wealthy, well married, occasionally prominent in the kingdom's own military and political affairs, but never once, across nearly 200 years, standing close enough to the actual throne of France to make its own eventual accession to that throne seem like anything other than one of the more improbable long shots in the whole of European dynastic history. The senior line of Bourbon dukes intermarried across these same 2 centuries, with a great many of the other great houses of France and its own borderlands, accumulating titles, alliances, and, in a handful of specific and well-documented instances, genuine royal blood from more than one direction, so that by the opening years of the 1500s, the House of Bourbon stood, in the strict and formal reckoning of French dynastic law, as the most senior surviving branch of the whole Capetian family tree outside the reigning line itself, a distinction that mattered enormously in the abstract and mattered in the ordinary daily politics of the 16th century, hardly at all, since the reigning Valois line descended from the very same Capetian stock through an entirely separate branch, showed every sign, for most of this same period, of continuing to produce sons of its own indefinitely. It is worth pausing and dwelling on the single most dramatic and most genuinely damaging episode this same senior Bourbon line actually produced in these centuries, because it very nearly extinguished the family's own claim to any future royal legitimacy altogether, and it is a story this channel believes deserves to be told honestly rather than smoothed over, the way a family's own later glory so often tempts its own later chroniclers to smooth over the embarrassments that came before it. Charles III, Duke of Bourbon, who held, by the early 1500s, not merely his own hereditary duchy, but the exceptionally prestigious office of Constable of France, the kingdom's own senior military commander, found himself, in the early 1520s, locked in a bitter and increasingly personal dispute with his own sovereign, King Francis I, a dispute that began over a contested inheritance, Charles's own late wife's considerable estate, which the king's own mother, Louise of Savoy, attempted to claim for the crown through a legal manoeuvre Charles regarded, with real and understandable justification, as an act of outright royal theft directed specifically against him. Rather than accept this same confiscation, Charles, in an act of treason that shocked contemporaries across the whole of Western Europe, and that this channel does not intend to soften in the telling, secretly defected to the service of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, France's own single greatest rival power, and spent the remaining years of his own life commanding armies against the very kingdom his own family had served for 2 centuries, dying in 1527 while leading an imperial army in the brutal and infamous sack of Rome itself, a betrayal so complete that it stripped the senior line of the House of Bourbon of its own titles, its own lands, and very nearly its own future entirely, since Charles died without any surviving legitimate children, extinguishing the senior branch of the family in the very same act of treachery that had already disgraced its own name. It is worth pausing on how strange, in hindsight, this same episode actually makes everything that followed, because the House of Bourbon that would eventually inherit the crown of France was not, in the end, the great senior branch that had held the constable's own office and the duchy's own ancestral lands, but a considerably more junior cadet branch within the cadet branch, the House of Bourbon-Vendôme, descended from a younger son of an earlier Bourbon duke, a family that had, across these same 2 centuries, been pushed even further from the centre of French royal prestige than the senior line it would eventually replace, holding a comparatively modest county rather than the ducal seat itself, and it was this same overlooked and doubly peripheral branch of the family, rather than the grand and disgraced senior line that history had actually been quietly preserving all along for the throne none of its own members could have seriously expected to occupy. A kingdom in the mountains, and a queen who raised her son on scripture and gunpowder. It is worth pausing now, and turning our attention specifically to the man whose own birth this story has already told you would eventually matter more than any other single birth in this whole dynastic tale. Because Henry, the future Henry IV of France, was born on the 13th of December, 1553, at the castle of Pau, in the small independent kingdom of Navarre, Tucked into the foothills of the Pyrenees between France and Spain, a kingdom his own family had acquired through marriage rather than conquest, and that gave the Bourbon Vendôme branch of the family a royal title of its own, however modest. Considerably earlier than any Bourbon would actually sit on the throne of France itself, Henry's own father, Antoine de Bourbon, was Duke of Vendôme, and, through his own marriage to Jeanne d'Albret, titular King of Navarre, a man contemporaries generally described as personally brave but politically indecisive, shifting his own religious and political allegiances more than once across the turbulent decades of France's own escalating religious crisis. A man whose own vacillation stands in genuinely sharp contrast to the fierce, unwavering conviction of the woman he had married. It is worth pausing, at real length, on Jeanne d'Albret herself, because no single individual in this entire story did more to shape the specific religious and political character of the man who would eventually found the Bourbon royal line than his own mother did. And it is worth pausing too on how genuinely unusual a figure she actually was among the royal women of her own era. Jeanne, ruling Navarre in her own right as its own sovereign queen, converted to Calvinism in 1560, and thereafter devoted herself, with a single-minded intensity several contemporary observers described as bordering on the fanatical, to establishing Protestant worship throughout her own small kingdom, and to raising her own son, the young Henry, as a committed and instructed Calvinist, rather than the ordinary nominal Catholic most princes of his own rank were raised to be. Jeanne's own famous insistence, recorded by more than one contemporary source, that her own son be raised on plain country food, and encouraged to run barefoot among the ordinary children of the Navarrese countryside, rather than confined to the soft and sheltered upbringing of a typical royal nursery, reflects a specific and deliberate philosophy of kingship this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on, a conviction that a future king ought to know, in his own body and not merely in his own theoretical understanding, the hardship and the practical realities of the people he would someday govern, an upbringing that several modern historians credit directly with a specific blend of physical toughness, personal charm, and genuine rapport with ordinary soldiers and ordinary subjects that would eventually make Henry one of the most personally beloved monarchs in the whole of French history. It is worth pausing, too, on the wider and considerably darker world into which Henry was actually born, because France, by the time of his own birth, stood already on the brink of the specific catastrophe that would consume the whole of his own childhood and young adulthood, a religious civil war between the kingdom's own Catholic majority and its own increasingly organised and increasingly militant Protestant minority, the Huguenots, a conflict that would erupt into open warfare only 9 years after Henry's own birth, and that would continue in 8 separate and successive rounds of fighting, punctuated by uneasy truces that rarely held for more than a year or two at a stretch, for the better part of the following 4 decades. A religious war, this channel's audience should understand from the outset, was never merely a dispute over theology in any narrow sense, but a struggle over political power, over noble faction, over royal succession, and over the very question of who was actually entitled to rule France at all. Questions that would eventually place the young Calvinist king of a small mountain kingdom directly, and almost accidentally, at the centre of the entire conflict's own resolution. It is worth pausing, briefly, on Henry's own father, before we follow the son any further into this story, because Antoine de Bourbon did not live to see any part of the specific drama this whole night has already described to you, dying in November 1562 of a wound received during the siege of Rouen, a Catholic-held city. Antoine, fighting on the royal Catholic side despite his own earlier flirtations with the Protestant cause, had been besieging on behalf of the young King Charles IX, a death that left the 8-year-old Henry fatherless in the middle of the first of what would eventually become 8 separate rounds of French religious civil war, and that placed the boy's own upbringing even more completely in the hands of his own fiercely Calvinist mother than it might otherwise have been, a detail this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on, because it means the specific blend of battlefield pragmatism and religious flexibility Henry would go on to display across his own entire adult life was shaped, from a genuinely early age, by a childhood in which his own father died fighting on one side of a religious war, his own mother had already committed the family, with rather less ambiguity, to the opposite side of. A wedding meant to end a war, and a massacre that began a new one. It is worth pausing, at considerable length, on the single most notorious episode of Henry's own young adulthood, because it very nearly ended his own life before his own dynasty had ever properly begun, and it stands to this day as one of the darkest single episodes in the whole of French religious history. In August of 1572, the French royal court arranged a marriage between the young Henry of Navarre, by then king of his own small realm following his own mother's death earlier that same year, and Margaret of Valois, sister of the reigning French king Charles IX, a match explicitly intended by the political architects who arranged it, chief among them the formidable Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici, to serve as a genuine gesture of reconciliation between France's own warring Catholic and Protestant factions. A royal wedding meant to model, for the whole of the fractured kingdom, the possibility of peace between two communities that had already spent a full decade killing one another in the name of God. It is worth pausing at some length on the specific siege that finally forced Henry's own hand toward the conversion. This whole story has already promised you would eventually come, because Henry's own 5-month blockade of Paris itself, in the spring and summer of 1590, before his own eventual conversion 3 years later, produced a level of civilian suffering inside the city walls that several contemporary accounts describe in genuinely harrowing detail. A starving population reduced by the accounts of more than one eyewitness to grinding the bones of the dead into a kind of bread flour in a desperate final effort to keep the city's own poorest residents alive. A famine so severe that Henry himself, by several later accounts, eventually permitted a limited number of the city's own non-combatants to pass through his own lines, rather than watch them starve outright beneath the walls he was besieging, a gesture of comparative mercy. This channel finds worth setting alongside the same king's own earlier restraint after Coutras, evidence of a specific and consistent personal temperament that distinguished Henry, across the whole of his own military career, from a great many of his own era's considerably less merciful commanders. It is worth pausing and dwelling on what actually happened only days after that same wedding was celebrated in Paris, because the marriage that was supposed to symbolise reconciliation instead became the occasion for one of the most infamous massacres of the entire era, on the night of the 23rd into the 24th of August, in what has come to be known across the whole of subsequent history as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Catholic mobs in Paris, apparently acting on orders that originated in some still debated combination of royal panic and factional opportunism, from within the highest levels of the French court itself, turned on the thousands of prominent Huguenot nobles who had gathered in the city for the royal wedding, killing a considerable number of them in their own beds in the opening hours of violence, a slaughter that spread over the following days and weeks from Paris into a considerable number of provincial cities across France, claiming, by even the more conservative modern estimates, somewhere in the range of 10,000 Protestant lives across the kingdom as a whole, a toll this channel does not intend to round comfortably downward, because a great many of the dead in this specific massacre were, unlike the anonymous foot soldiers and pilgrims whose own uncounted deaths this channel has mourned in other stories, men of real prominence whose own individual names and individual fates the surviving record actually allows us to trace, which makes the sheer scale of the killing, once we multiply that same individual horror across 10,000 separate lives, considerably harder to hold in the mind rather than easier. It is worth pausing specifically on how narrowly Henry of Navarre himself survived this same catastrophe, because his own survival, on which this entire subsequent dynastic story genuinely depends, appears to have rested on nothing more assured than his own new and highly convenient royal rank as the king's own brother-in-law, a status that spared him the immediate massacre that claimed so many of his own Protestant companions and countrymen in the very same city on the very same night. But that came at a considerable and genuinely humiliating price, because Henry was given, in the days that followed, a stark and unambiguous choice between immediate conversion to Catholicism and probable death, a choice he made, by his own later account and by the account of nearly every contemporary chronicler, with the pragmatic and unsentimental calculation that would come to define his own entire political career. Converting outwardly to the Catholic faith he had been raised from infancy to regard as a corruption of the true gospel in order to preserve, for whatever future use it might eventually serve, his own continued life. It is worth pausing, too, on the 4 years that followed this same forced conversion, because Henry spent them, in effect, as a closely watched and only nominally free prisoner of the French court, a Protestant king held at Paris under the guise of royal hospitality, while the wider religious war raged on beyond the city's own walls, until, in February of 1576, Henry finally succeeded in escaping the capital, fleeing back to his own southern territories, publicly renouncing the Catholic conversion he had accepted only under the direct threat of the executioner's own blade, and resuming from that point onward both his own Protestant faith and his own active military leadership of the Huguenot cause, a reversal that several of his own later biographers have treated as the moment Henry's own genuinely formidable political character finally emerged from beneath the pragmatic survivor of St. Bartholomew's Night, a man willing to bend when bending was the only alternative to death, but never so far and never for so long that he actually forgot which direction he intended eventually to bend back. It is worth pausing, too, on the 4 years Henry spent, after his own escape from Paris in February of 1576, actually rebuilding his own military and political position at the head of the Huguenot cause, because this same period is worth remembering whenever a later chapter of this story tempts us to see Henry's own eventual crown as somehow inevitable, since Henry spent these same years as one contested regional leader among several, commanding real loyalty across the Protestant south and west of France, but genuinely uncertain at nearly every point across this same decade, whether his own cause would ever amount to more than one faction's own survival in a kingdom that seemed, by the early 1580s, no closer to lasting peace than it had been when the fighting first began in 1562. It is worth pausing at some length on the single battle from these same years that did more than any other to establish Henry's own personal military reputation, because at Coutras, in October of 1587, Henry commanded a considerably smaller Huguenot force to a decisive victory over a royal Catholic army, a battle contemporaries on both sides of the religious divide recognised as a genuine tactical masterpiece, Henry's own careful use of combined cavalry and firearms breaking the larger royal force in a matter of hours. And it is worth pausing, too, on a specific and genuinely telling detail several surviving accounts record about Henry's own conduct after this same victory, that he treated his own defeated Catholic prisoners, among them a considerable number of prominent French noblemen, with a courtesy and a personal generosity several contemporary chroniclers found remarkable for a civil war already notorious, on both of its own sides, for exactly the kind of atrocity this channel has already described to you at St. Bartholomew, a pattern of comparative restraint in victory that would go on to characterise nearly the whole of Henry's own subsequent military career, and that several modern historians credit directly with softening, however gradually, the specific Catholic hostility toward Henry's own eventual succession that the wider religious war might otherwise have hardened into something considerably less reconcilable. It is worth pausing briefly on the specific pattern of intermittent and uneasy truce that actually characterised the whole of these 36 years of intermittent French religious war, because the Peace of Saint-Germain, concluded in 1570, 2 years before the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, this channel has already described to you tonight, granted the Huguenots a real, if temporary, measure of legal toleration, and several fortified towns for their own security, an agreement contemporaries hoped might finally settle the kingdom's own religious divide, and that instead lasted barely 2 years before collapsing entirely in the very massacre this same fragile peace had been meant to prevent, a pattern of short truce followed by fresh catastrophe that repeated itself in slightly varying form across nearly every one of the 8 separate rounds of fighting. This whole conflict eventually produced. It is worth pausing too on the specific organisation behind the Catholic resistance to Henry's own eventual succession, because the Catholic League, formally founded in 1576 under the leadership of Henry, Duke of Guise, and reorganised with even greater militancy in the early 1580s, specifically in response to the growing likelihood of a Protestant succession, functioned as considerably more than a loose religious faction, maintaining its own network of urban committees across a great many French cities, its own independent taxation, and its own direct financial and military alliance with Catholic Spain, whose own king, Philip II, subsidised the League's own resistance to Henry, precisely because a Bourbon succession in France threatened Spain's own strategic interests every bit as much as it threatened French Catholic religious sensibilities. A reminder this channel finds worth pausing on, that the specific war this whole part of our story has described to you was never merely a domestic French religious dispute, but a conflict with its own genuinely international dimension, fought as much for the strategic advantage of foreign courts as for the religious conviction of the French subjects actually doing the fighting and the dying. A brother's death and a Protestant king becomes the last hope of a Catholic kingdom. It is worth pausing now on the single specific and genuinely improbable accident of biology that transformed Henry of Navarre, almost overnight, from a Protestant rebel commanding one faction in an ongoing civil war into the legally undisputed heir to the entire throne of Catholic France, because it is worth remembering, at every stage of this story, exactly how contingent this whole dynasty's own eventual rise actually was on events no single person involved could have planned or predicted with any confidence. King Henry III of France, who had succeeded his own brother Charles IX in 1574, had, by the early 1580s, produced no children of his own, and his own only remaining full brother, Francis, Duke of Anjou, who had spent much of the preceding decade pursuing a series of increasingly desperate and increasingly unsuccessful political and military schemes across France's own Low Countries border, died of illness in June of 1584 at only 29 years old, extinguishing in that single unremarkable sickbed death the entire direct male line of the House of Valois beyond the reigning king himself. It is worth pausing on exactly what this same death actually meant under the specific and rigid rules of French royal succession, because the law of the French crown, unlike the practice of a great many other European monarchies, permitted no inheritance through or by a woman, and required, in the absence of any closer male Valois relative, that the throne pass to the most senior surviving male descendant of the Capetian royal line by unbroken male descent, regardless of how many intervening generations or how many centuries separated that descendant from the reigning king, a rule that pointed once every closer branch of the family had been exhausted, directly and unambiguously at Henry of Navarre, the senior surviving male of the House of Bourbon, a family that had spent, as we have already discussed tonight, nearly 3 full centuries as a peripheral and largely overlooked branch of French royalty, and that now found itself, through nothing more dramatic than the ordinary failure of a series of royal marriages to produce surviving sons, standing next in line for the single most powerful throne in Western Europe. It is worth pausing and naming plainly exactly how unacceptable a great many of Henry's own future subjects found this same legal reality, because a Protestant heir to the Catholic throne of France was, to the kingdom's own considerable Catholic majority, and especially to the militantly organised Catholic League led by the powerful Duke of Guise, not merely an unwelcome inconvenience, but a genuine existential threat to the religious character of the kingdom itself. And it is this same fundamental rejection, rather than any simple continuation of the earlier religious wars, that actually produced the specific and increasingly desperate conflict known to history as the War of the Three Henrys, a three-cornered struggle among King Henry III, attempting to preserve some measure of royal authority against factions on every side of him. Henry, Duke of Guise, leading the militant Catholic League and enjoying by the late 1580s the enthusiastic support of a considerable portion of the Parisian population and the covert financial backing of Catholic Spain, and Henry of Navarre himself, commanding the Huguenot cause and holding, however contested it remained in practice, the single strongest legal claim to the throne any of the three men could actually make. A duke assassinated by royal order, and a king assassinated in turn. It is worth pausing at some length on the specific sequence of violence that unfolded across the final months of 1588 and the opening months of 1589, because it is a sequence this channel believes deserves to be told in some careful detail, given how directly it produced the exact scene this whole story opened with tonight. King Henry III, increasingly alarmed by the growing power and the growing popular support of Henry, Duke of Guise, whose own Catholic League had, by the winter of 1588, effectively displaced royal authority across large portions of France, and even within Paris itself, made the fateful decision to have the Duke assassinated, summoning Guise to the royal chateau at Blois under the pretext of a council meeting, and having him cut down by the king's own bodyguards in the very corridors of the royal residence in December of that same year, a killing that eliminated Henry's own most dangerous rival, but that also, in the eyes of a great many of the kingdom's own devout Catholics, confirmed the king as a murderer of the church's own most visible defender, a perception that the Catholic League, now led by Guise's own surviving relatives, exploited with real and immediate political effect, denouncing Henry III as an illegitimate tyrant and a secret ally of the Protestant heretic he was, by this same point being forced by simple political necessity to actually cooperate within the field. It is worth pausing and returning one final time before we move forward in the story to the specific act of vengeance this same denunciation eventually produced, because it was in this exact atmosphere of religious fury and popular incitement against the king that Jacques Clément, the young friar this story opened with tonight, resolved to strike Henry III down in turn, a killing that this channel has already described to you in full at the very beginning of tonight's telling, and it is worth naming plainly the genuinely strange symmetry of this whole sequence. A king who ordered the assassination of a duke who threatened his own throne, assassinated himself only 8 months later by a fanatic acting in that same duke's own name, a chain of violence that left at its own final link a battle-hardened Protestant king of Navarre standing as the last man alive with any credible legal claim to the crown of France at all. A crown that a great many of his own new subjects, watching from behind the walls of a Paris still controlled by the militant Catholic League, had absolutely no intention of actually allowing him to wear. A city worth a mass, and a war ended by conversion rather than conquest. It is worth pausing at real length on the 4 difficult years that followed Henry III's own death, because Henry of Navarre's own succession to the French throne, though legally uncontested by even his own bitterest enemies, remained for the whole of this same period a claim that existed largely on paper, a king recognised by the law of the kingdom but denied its own capital city, denied the loyalty of large portions of its own nobility, and denied, most importantly, the one thing that would actually settle the matter in the eyes of the overwhelming majority of his own French subjects, a shared religious faith with the people he claimed the right to rule. Henry spent these same years fighting a genuinely difficult and genuinely uncertain military campaign against the Catholic League and its own considerable Spanish financial and military backing, winning a series of notable battlefield victories at Arques in 1589 and at Ivry in 1590, that demonstrated his own genuine tactical skill and his own personal courage in the field, and that this channel's audience, familiar by now with how thoroughly military success alone has so rarely, across the whole span of history, been sufficient on its own to settle a war rooted this deeply in religious conviction, will not be surprised to learn did nothing decisive to actually end the wider conflict. It is worth pausing and dwelling on the specific and genuinely pragmatic solution Henry eventually arrived at, because it is the single decision, more than any battle he ever won, that actually secured his own throne, and it is worth naming, honestly, exactly how cynical a calculation it appears on the surviving evidence actually to have been, whatever genuine spiritual reconsideration may also have been mixed into it. In July of 1593, after 4 years spent commanding a Protestant claim to a Catholic throne, with no realistic prospect of ever actually reconciling the two, Henry formally abjured Protestantism and converted for the second and this time permanent occasion in his own life to the Catholic faith, in a ceremony held at the Basilica of Saint-Denis outside Paris, a conversion later generations of French popular memory would come to associate with a single-pointed remark attributed to Henry himself, that Paris was well worth a mass, a line whose own precise authenticity no surviving contemporary document can actually confirm beyond doubt, but that captures, with real economy, exactly the kind of unsentimental political calculation that had already saved Henry's own life once before, at the point of a different set of swords, on the night of St. Bartholomew. It is worth pausing on how immediately and how thoroughly this same conversion actually worked, in purely practical terms, because Henry's own acceptance of the Catholic faith removed, at a single stroke, the one genuinely insurmountable objection that had kept large portions of the French nobility and the French Catholic clergy from accepting his own already undisputed legal claim to the throne, and Paris itself, the city whose own resistance had defined the entire war, opened its own gates to Henry in March of 1594. A peaceful entry this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on for a moment, because it stands in such stark and deliberate contrast to nearly every other siege and every other city's own fall. This channel has ever described to you a conquest achieved not through breach and slaughter, but through the considerably quieter and considerably more durable instrument of a single well-timed religious conversion. It is worth pausing, briefly, on a specific and genuinely telling detail of Henry's own actual coronation, because French kings had, for centuries, traditionally been crowned at the great cathedral of Reims, but Reims, like Paris itself, remained in the hands of the Catholic League. At the time Henry's own conversion finally cleared the way for a formal coronation ceremony, so that Henry was crowned instead in February of 1594 at the considerably less prestigious Cathedral of Chartres. A substitution this channel finds worth naming plainly, because it captures, in a single small ceremonial detail, exactly how incomplete and how genuinely contested Henry's own kingship still remained even at the very moment of his own formal coronation, a king crowned in the wrong cathedral, ruling a capital he had not yet entered, over a kingdom whose own league-held cities would continue negotiating their own individual submissions to his own authority for months, and, in a handful of stubborn cases, years afterward. It's worth pausing, finally, on the formal settlement Henry issued in 1598 to bring the whole of France's own 36 years of intermittent religious war to a genuine and lasting close, because the Edict of Nantes, granting France's own Protestant minority a specific and legally guaranteed measure of religious toleration, the right to worship openly in designated towns, the right to hold public office, and the right to maintain a number of fortified towns for their own security, represented, for its own era, an unusually pragmatic and unusually durable religious settlement, one that would hold with only intermittent strain for the better part of the following 87 years, and that reflected, in its own careful balancing of competing religious claims, exactly the kind of practical and sentimental statecraft that had already carried Henry through every previous crisis of his own remarkable career, a king who had converted his own faith twice under duress and once by calculation, and who now, having finally secured his own throne through that same calculation, extended to his own former co-religionists a measure of protection considerably more generous than most Catholic monarchs of his own era would ever have thought to offer at all. A kingdom rebuilt, and a king who fed his own people before he armed them. It is worth pausing before we follow this whole story toward its own next great catastrophe on the specific and genuinely remarkable work Henry IV actually did in the 11 years of relative peace. His own conversion and his own edict had finally purchased for France, because it is this same period, more than any of the military campaigns that preceded it, that actually explains why Henry remains, to this day, one of the most personally beloved monarchs in the whole of French popular memory. Working closely with his own trusted minister, the Duke of Sully, Henry oversaw a genuinely thorough reconstruction of a kingdom that 36 years of religious civil war had left financially exhausted, agriculturally devastated in large stretches of its own countryside, and administratively chaotic, reforming the kingdom's own tax collection to reduce the specific abuses that had fallen most heavily on its own poorest peasants, investing in road and canal construction that improved trade across the kingdom's own internal provinces, and promoting, with real personal enthusiasm, agricultural improvement and the cultivation of crops, silk production among them, that Henry believed capable of enriching ordinary French farmers rather than merely the kingdom's own already wealthy nobility. It is worth pausing too on a specific remark popular tradition has long attributed to Henry, a wish expressed to a Savoy diplomat and recorded in some form by more than one contemporary source, that he hoped to see the day when every peasant family in his own kingdom could afford a chicken in the pot on a Sunday, a line whose own precise wording, like the mass remark that secured him Paris, cannot be verified with full documentary confidence, but that reflects in its own specific imagery exactly the kind of concern for ordinary material welfare that several genuinely documented policies of his own reign actually bear out, and that helps explain why Henry, alone among the whole long line of French kings this channel may someday tell you about in other stories, came to be remembered by ordinary French people across the centuries that followed his own death, with a warmth and an affection considerably more genuine than the more distant reverence reserved for most of his own royal successors. It is worth pausing briefly on a specific and genuinely lasting piece of infrastructure this same reconstruction actually produced. Because Sully began, under Henry's own direct patronage, the construction of the Canal de Briare, intended to link the River Loire and the River Seine, and so open a continuous inland waterway between the Atlantic coast and Paris itself, a project only partially completed by the time of Henry's own death, but eventually finished under his own successors, and a specific and durable reminder, this channel finds worth naming, that a great deal of Henry's own genuine popularity with ordinary French people rested not on any single dramatic act of statecraft, but on this same patient, unglamorous and thoroughly practical investment in the everyday material infrastructure of his own kingdom's own commerce, a carriage in a narrow street, and a second Bourbon king struck down by a blade. It is worth pausing and dwelling on how abruptly this same period of reconstruction actually ended, because it stands as one of several moments in this whole story where the entire Bourbon project came within a single knife's edge of being extinguished before it had ever properly taken root. On the 14th of May, 1610, Henry's own royal carriage, held up in traffic on a narrow Parisian street called the Rue de la Ferronnerie, was approached by a man named François Ravaillac, a religious fanatic convinced by his own later confession that Henry intended to make war on the Pope and on the whole of Catholic Christendom, who climbed onto the halted carriage and stabbed the king twice, the second blow piercing his own lung and killing him within minutes. Henry IV, the first Bourbon king of France, the man who had survived a massacre, 2 religious conversions and years of open civil war, died at 56 years old in the middle of a Parisian street at the hands of a single deranged assassin. A death that this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on for its own sheer and bitter irony. A king whose entire life had been a study in surviving violence through calculation and adaptability, finally undone not by any army or any organised conspiracy, but by the same kind of isolated religious fanaticism that had very nearly claimed him once before, decades earlier, in the massacre that opened this whole part of his story. It is worth pausing on how precarious the Bourbon succession actually was at this exact moment, because Henry's own heir, the future Louis XIII, was only 8 years old at the time of his own father's murder, a child king inheriting a throne his own family had held at that point for barely 21 years, a succession crisis this channel's audience, familiar by now with how often a royal minority has produced exactly the kind of factional chaos and noble rebellion that a strong adult monarch's own personal authority was generally required to suppress, will recognise immediately as one of the single most dangerous moments any newly established dynasty could actually face. And it is worth naming plainly that the House of Bourbon, at this specific hour, stood considerably closer to a premature and humiliating collapse than to the extraordinary accumulation of power it would eventually achieve. A regency, a cardinal, and the quiet strangling of the old nobility. It is worth pausing at some length on the 2 decades that followed Henry's own assassination, because they are years this channel's audience may find, on their own specific merits, considerably less immediately dramatic than the wars and the conversions and the assassinations that came before them, but that actually did more to lay the specific institutional groundwork for the kind of centralised royal power the House of Bourbon would eventually wield at its own height than any single battle or any single treaty this story has described to you so far. Louis XIII's own mother, Marie de Medici, governed as regent through her own son's minority, a period several modern historians describe as marked by real factional instability among the great noble houses of France, each one eager to exploit the young king's own vulnerability for its own private advantage, until Louis, coming of age and asserting his own personal authority in the 1620s, elevated to the highest position in his own government, a churchman whose own name would come to define the whole of this era of French history considerably more thoroughly than the young king's own did, Armand Jean du Plessis, better known to posterity as Cardinal Richelieu. It is worth pausing, at real length, on exactly what Richelieu actually did with the power Louis granted him, because his own programme, pursued with a patience and a ruthlessness several contemporaries found genuinely alarming, aimed at nothing less than the systematic reduction of every rival source of independent power within the French kingdom. The great noble houses whose own private armies and private fortresses had made every previous French king's own authority genuinely contested, and the Huguenot political and military strongholds that Henry IV's own Edict of Nantes had preserved. Cities like La Rochelle that functioned in practical terms almost as independent Protestant statelets within the wider kingdom. Richelieu's own siege of La Rochelle, conducted across much of 1627 and 1628, involved the construction of an extraordinary seawall across the harbour's own mouth, specifically to prevent English naval relief from reaching the besieged city, an engineering achievement this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on, because it reduced the city's own defenders to such complete and prolonged starvation, by several surviving accounts reducing the besieged population to eating leather, and, in the most desperate final weeks, considerably worse, that La Rochelle's own eventual surrender effectively ended organised Huguenot political and military independence within France for good, even as it preserved in its own aftermath the basic religious toleration Henry IV's own edict had originally guaranteed. It is worth pausing too on how directly Richelieu's own broader policy of centralising royal authority against the great feudal nobility actually laid the institutional foundation for the kind of absolute monarchy France's own most famous Bourbon king would eventually wield, because Richelieu worked, across the whole of his own tenure, to replace the kingdom's own traditional reliance on great noble governors, men whose own loyalty to the crown was always secondary to their own private family interests, with a new class of royal officials, the intendants, drawn from the kingdom's own rising professional and legal classes rather than its own ancient aristocracy. men whose own careers and whose own fortunes depended entirely on continued royal favour rather than on any independent territorial base of their own. A bureaucratic innovation that this channel's audience, familiar with how many of the disasters described in this channel's own previous stories, trace back to precisely this kind of divided and competing loyalty among a kingdom's own great lords, will recognise as one of the single most consequential administrative reforms of the entire era. It is worth pausing, too, on how narrowly Richelieu himself survived within his own king's favour across these same years, because Louis XIII's own mother, Marie de Médicis, who had never forgiven the cardinal for eclipsing her own influence over her own son, mounted in November of 1630, a final and genuinely serious attempt to have Richelieu removed from office entirely, extracting from Louis, in a private audience, what appeared to be a firm royal promise to dismiss his own chief minister, a promise that spread through the court so quickly and so confidently that the day itself came to be remembered by later historians as the Day of the Dupes, since the courtiers who had already begun celebrating Richelieu's own downfall, and in some documented cases already begun currying favour with whichever rival minister they expected to replace him, discovered within 24 hours that Louis had reversed his own decision entirely, confirming Richelieu in office and sending his own mother into permanent exile instead. A reversal this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on, because it illustrates exactly how personally dependent the whole of Richelieu's own transformative programme actually remained, at every single stage of its own execution, on the private and occasionally quite fragile favour of one specific king. It is worth pausing, too, on a second and considerably more lethal conspiracy Richelieu survived only a decade later, because in 1642, a young royal favourite named the Marquis de Cinq-Mars, resentful of Richelieu's own continued dominance over royal policy, entered into a secret treaty with Habsburg Spain, France's own enemy in the still ongoing 30 Years' War, aimed explicitly at removing the cardinal from power by force, a conspiracy Richelieu's own extensive network of informants uncovered before it could actually be carried out. And that ended with Cinq-Mars' own public execution in Lyon that same year, a fate Richelieu himself did not personally live to see much longer, since the cardinal died only months later, in December of 1642, his own health broken by decades of relentless work, having outlived, by the narrowest of margins, the final serious challenge to the centralised royal authority he'd spent nearly 2 decades constructing. It is worth pausing briefly on a considerably gentler and considerably more lasting legacy of this same period, because Richelieu, alongside his own ruthless political consolidation of royal power, also founded, in 1635, the Académie Française, an institution charged with regulating and standardising the French language itself, a project that reflected Richelieu's own genuine and specific conviction that a kingdom's own cultural and linguistic prestige mattered every bit as much to its own international standing as its own military and diplomatic strength, an institution that survives in recognisable form to this very day, considerably longer than any of the specific noble rebellions Richelieu spent the greater part of his own career suppressing. It is worth pausing finally on the wider European conflict into which Richelieu, despite his own ecclesiastical office, deliberately committed France, because the 30 Years' War, the catastrophic and religiously inflected conflict that consumed much of Central Europe across these same decades, presented Richelieu with an opportunity he pursued with real and calculated cynicism, allying Catholic France not with the Catholic Habsburg powers, who might have seemed its own natural religious partners, but against them, in support of the Protestant princes and the Protestant kingdoms of Sweden and the German lands, a policy driven entirely by the specific logic of state power and the specific French interest in weakening its own Habsburg rivals in Spain and Austria, rather than by any consideration of religious solidarity, a piece of pure and unsentimental statecraft that this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on, because it establishes, in the actions of the cardinal who effectively ran France for nearly 2 decades, exactly the kind of dynastic and national self-interest that would go on to define French and eventually Bourbon Spanish. Foreign policy for the whole of the following century. A child born after 23 years of waiting and a nickname that stuck for life. It is worth pausing briefly on the sheer improbability of Louis XIV's own birth before we follow him into his own eventual childhood crisis, because his own parents, Louis XIII and his own queen, Anne of Austria, had been married for 23 years, across a relationship several contemporary accounts describe as genuinely strained and genuinely distant for much of its own early duration, without producing a single surviving child, a childless royal marriage that had already, by the early 1630s, begun to raise real and anxious questions across the French court about the eventual succession, since Louis XIII's own next legal heir, in the absence of a son of his own, would have been his own younger brother Gaston, a prince widely regarded by nearly every contemporary account as considerably less capable and considerably less trustworthy than the reigning king himself. It is worth pausing and naming plainly exactly how much genuine relief and genuine celebration therefore greeted the birth of a healthy son at last. In September of 1638, a birth contemporaries took to calling the birth of Louis Dieudonné God-given, a nickname that stuck to the future Sun King for the whole of his own childhood, and that captures, in its own specific religious framing, exactly how contingent even this dynasty's own most celebrated individual reign actually was on the ordinary biological uncertainty of a single royal marriage, finally, after more than 2 decades, producing the heir it had been expected to produce so much earlier. A 5-year-old king and a capital city that rose in revolt against his own mother. It is worth pausing now before we arrive at the single most consequential reign in this entire story, on the childhood of the boy who would eventually become that reign's own central figure, because Louis XIV's own formative years, like his own grandfather's assassination and his own father's difficult minority, were shaped by a genuine and genuinely frightening brush with the collapse of royal authority that this channel believes explains a great deal about the specific character of the absolutism Louis would eventually impose on France. Louis was only 4 years old when his own father, Louis XIII, died in 1643, inheriting a throne once again in the hands of a child, with his own mother, Anne of Austria, governing as regent alongside Richelieu's own chosen successor as chief minister, the Italian-born Cardinal Mazarin, a partnership that a considerable body of the French nobility and the French judicial establishment, the Parlement, deeply resented, regarding Mazarin specifically as a foreign upstart wielding a degree of royal authority no properly French minister, in their own view, ought to have been permitted to hold. It is worth pausing at some length on the specific rebellion this same resentment eventually produced, because the Fronde, a complicated and multi-staged uprising that convulsed France across the years 1648 to 1653, involved in its own successive phases, first the kingdom's own judicial and administrative elite protesting royal fiscal policy, and then, in a considerably more dangerous second phase, a substantial portion of the kingdom's own great nobility taking up arms against the crown itself, at times in open alliance with foreign powers still actively at war with France. A rebellion that at one especially dangerous point in 1648 forced the young king and his own mother to flee Paris itself under cover of night. The royal family reduced by several surviving accounts to genuinely modest and genuinely frightening personal circumstances, sleeping in borrowed beds and depending on the loyalty of a shrinking circle of retainers whose own fidelity, in the middle of a civil rebellion of this scale, could never be entirely assured. It is worth pausing and naming plainly Exactly how formative this same childhood experience appears to have been for the adult King Louis would eventually become, because nearly every modern historian who has studied the specific psychology of Louis's own later absolutism traces at least part of its own origin directly back to these exact months of genuine personal danger and genuine personal humiliation. A boy king who had been forced to flee his own capital in fear of his own subjects, and who resolved, once he had actually secured his own throne beyond any further challenge, that no French monarch would ever again be placed in a position of such vulnerability, a resolution that would eventually express itself in the most thoroughly centralised and the most elaborately controlled royal court the whole of Europe had ever seen. It is worth pausing at some length on the specific two-part structure of this same rebellion, because the Fronde is worth understanding not as a single continuous revolt, but as two related and successive crises that together taught the young king an even harsher lesson than either phase, taken alone, might have delivered. The first phase, generally called the Fronde parlementaire, and running through 1648 and into 1649, saw the Parisian judicial elite, the members of the kingdom's own high law courts, resist new royal taxation and demand a formal check on royal fiscal authority. A genuinely serious constitutional crisis that ended only when the Crown, considerably weakened by its own continuing commitments abroad in the 30 Years' War, agreed to a compromise settlement. The second and considerably more dangerous phase, the Fronde des Princes, erupted in 1650 and drew in a considerable portion of France's own greatest aristocratic families, chief among them the Prince of Condé, one of the kingdom's own most celebrated military commanders, who turned his own considerable talents against the crown he had so recently served, at one point commanding an army that fought royal forces in the very streets of Paris itself, and who eventually, when his own rebellion finally collapsed, fled France entirely to take up service, in a betrayal that echoes uncomfortably with the earlier treason of the Constable of Bourbon. This channel has already described to you tonight in the army of Spain, France's own enemy, for several years before an eventual royal pardon allowed his own return. It is worth pausing and naming plainly exactly how close this same rebellion actually came to permanently damaging the young king's own capacity to trust his own highest nobility. Because Louis would go on, across the whole of his own adult reign, to draw his own most senior military and ministerial appointments overwhelmingly from families of comparatively recent and comparatively modest origin, rather than from the ancient aristocratic houses whose own members had so recently taken up arms against him. A specific and lasting policy preference several modern historians trace directly back to the personal wounds. This same childhood rebellion left behind a young king who had watched, from uncomfortably close range, exactly how quickly even a France's own most celebrated general could turn his own sword against his own sovereign the moment royal favour seemed to be running against him, a cardinal's death, and a young king who decided to rule without a chief minister at all. It is worth pausing, briefly, on the specific moment Louis's own personal reign actually began in practice, rather than merely in name, because Cardinal Mazarin, who had continued to govern France in the young king's own name for a full 18 years, effectively as the kingdom's own chief minister in the exact tradition Richelieu had established before him, died in March of 1661, and Louis, then 22 years old, made a decision that startled the whole of his own court and the whole of the diplomatic establishments watching France from abroad, announcing that he intended to govern henceforth without appointing any single chief minister at all, that he himself, rather than any cardinal or any favoured aristocrat, would personally direct the whole of the kingdom's own government from that day forward, a declaration of genuinely thoroughgoing personal absolutism that Louis would go on to honour with remarkable consistency for the whole of the following 54 years, the longest reign of any monarch in recorded European history. It is worth pausing at some length on the specific instrument Louis actually used to make this same personal absolutism genuinely durable rather than merely rhetorical. because it is here that the palace this whole story's audience most likely already associates with the Bourbon dynasty above every other single landmark actually enters our story. Louis, over the course of the 1660s and 1670s, transformed a comparatively modest hunting lodge his own father had built at Versailles, some miles outside Paris, into an extraordinary palace complex of a scale and an opulence without precedent anywhere in contemporary Europe. And it is worth pausing on why he did this, because Versailles was never in its own original conception merely a display of royal wealth for its own sake, but a deliberately engineered instrument of political control, a residence to which Louis eventually required the whole of France's own great nobility to relocate for a substantial portion of every year, drawing the same restless and rebellious aristocratic families whose own private power bases had fueled the Fronde only a decade or two before into a single, tightly controlled and elaborately ritualized court environment, where a nobleman's own status and own influence came to depend not on his own independent territorial power, but on his own proximity to the king's own person during the minutely regulated ceremonies, the lever, the caucha, the ordinary business of watching the king dress and undress and dine, that structured every single day at Versailles down to the smallest gesture. It is worth pausing at some length on the specific architects and the specific army of labourers who actually turned Louis's own vision of Versailles into physical stone and water, because the project directed across its own several decades of continuous construction by the architects Louis Levaux and later Jules Ardouin-Mansart, and by the landscape designer André Le Nôtre, whose own formal gardens, with their own precisely geometric parterres and their own elaborate fountain systems fed by a genuinely enormous hydraulic engineering effort, diverting water from the river Eure many miles distant, employed, at the height of its own construction, tens of thousands of labourers at any given time, a workforce that included, by several surviving accounts, a considerable number of soldiers detailed from the army's own regular regiments to dig and haul in the palace's own gardens during peacetime, and that suffered, across the several decades of the project's own construction, a death toll from disease and from simple construction accidents that no contemporary record ever bothered to total with any precision. One more instance. This channel finds worth naming plainly, of the ordinary anonymous human cost so much of this entire dynastic story has already asked you to hold in mind. It is worth pausing too on the specific and minutely regulated daily ritual life at Versailles actually organised itself around, because Louis structured every single hour of his own day, from his own formal awakening ceremony, the lever, attended by a strictly ranked sequence of courtiers, each permitted to perform some specific small service, handing the king his own shirt or his own wig, in an order of precedence so exactly calibrated that a single misplaced privilege could provoke weeks of genuine court outrage through his own public meals, taken in full view of any courtier or any respectable visitor who cared to watch the King of France eat his own dinner, to his own formal retiring ceremony, the cauchy, that mirrored the morning's own ritual in reverse, a daily choreography this channel's audience may find, on first hearing, almost comically elaborate. But that served, as we have already discussed tonight, a genuinely serious political purpose, transforming the king's own most ordinary bodily functions into a currency of status precious enough to keep an entire once rebellious aristocracy competing for scraps of royal proximity rather than plotting, as an earlier generation of that same aristocracy so recently had, in the shadows of their own private estates. It is worth pausing too on the specific women who exercised real and often considerable influence over Louis across the different decades of this same long reign, because Louis's own long relationship with Madame de Montespan, who bore him several children across the 1660s and 1670s, gave way, in the king's own later years, to a considerably quieter and, by most contemporary accounts, considerably more stabilising relationship with Madame de Maintenon. a woman of comparatively modest birth who had originally been engaged to govern Louise's own children by Montespan, and whom Louis eventually married in a secret and never publicly acknowledged ceremony following the death of his own queen in 1683, a relationship several modern historians credit with encouraging the specific turn towards stricter religious observance that would culminate only 2 years later in the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. This channel has already described to you tonight one more instance of a single private relationship shaping, in ways no formal treaty or formal council ever fully captured, the specific direction an entire kingdom's own policy would eventually take. It is worth pausing on how genuinely effective this same strategy actually proved, because a French nobility kept busy competing for the privilege of handing the king his own shirt in the morning, and financially strained by the considerable cost of maintaining the kind of lavish, personal establishment Versailles' own social competition demanded, had, by the later decades of Louis's own reign, been transformed from the genuinely dangerous and genuinely independent political force that had nearly toppled the young king's own regency into an ornamental and largely dependent court aristocracy. Its own capacity for the kind of armed rebellion the Fronde had once demonstrated reduced, in practical terms, very nearly to nothing at all, a transformation several modern historians regard as one of the single, most successful, and most enduring political achievements of Louis's own entire reign, whatever its own genuinely enormous financial and human cost. It is worth pausing briefly, before we follow Louis into his own personal reign, on a single earlier marriage that this channel's audience should hold in mind, because it plants, decades in advance, the specific legal seed from which the entire War of the Spanish Succession this story will describe to you shortly would eventually grow. In 1659, the Peace of the Pyrenees finally ended a long and separate war between France and Spain that had run alongside the 30 Years' War, and the treaty's own settlement was sealed, in the customary fashion of the age, by a royal marriage, the young Louis XIV himself to the Spanish Infanta Maria Theresa, a marriage whose own specific terms required Maria Theresa to formally renounce, on her own behalf and on behalf of her own future children, any claim to the Spanish throne, in exchange for a substantial dowry Spain's own already strained treasury never actually paid in full. It is worth pausing on how directly this same unpaid dowry would eventually matter, because French jurists would argue, 4 decades later, when Charles II of Spain's own will named Louis's own grandson as his own heir, that a renunciation given only in exchange for a payment Spain itself had failed to honour could reasonably be considered null, a legal argument this channel finds genuinely worth naming, because it shows that even the specific claim that eventually secured a Bourbon prince the throne of Spain rested at bottom on a decades-old unpaid debt rather than on any purely uncontested principle of inheritance. A king who called himself the state, and the wars that eventually broke the treasury that built his own palace. It is worth pausing briefly on the specific minister who actually made Louis's own personal absolutism financially sustainable across these same decades, because Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who served as Louis's own Controller General of Finances from the 1660s until his own death in 1683, pursued a systematic policy of state-directed economic development, founding royal manufactures in luxury goods including tapestry, glass, and fine textiles, specifically to reduce French dependence on foreign imports, expanding the French navy from a genuinely modest force into one of the largest fleets in Europe, and reforming the kingdom's own tangled system of internal tolls and taxation, with a rigour that, while it never fully overcame the deep structural inequalities of a tax system that still fell disproportionately on the kingdom's own peasantry rather than its own privileged nobility and clergy, nonetheless funded a considerable share of both Versailles' own construction and Louis's own military ambitions without the kind of outright financial collapse that would eventually consume the French monarchy under Louis's own less fortunate successors, a specific institutional achievement this channel finds worth crediting honestly, whatever the wider human cost of the wars that same financial stability ultimately went on to fund. It is worth pausing too on the wide ambitions Louis pursued once his own personal authority within France stood beyond any serious internal challenge, because the same king who had built Versailles to control his own nobility spent the greater part of his own 54-year personal reign pursuing an almost continuous sequence of foreign wars. The War of Devolution in the late 1660s, the Franco-Dutch War of the 1670s, the War of the League of Augsburg in the 1690s, and finally, in the last and most consequential conflict of his own reign, the War of the Spanish Succession, wars fought in varying combinations to expand French territory along its own northern and eastern frontiers, to assert French dynastic and diplomatic supremacy over the whole of Western Europe, and, in that final and most significant conflict, to secure for Louis's own family a second crown entirely, a prize this channel will turn to in considerable detail in just a few minutes. It is worth pausing and being honest about the actual cost these same wars imposed on the ordinary people of France, because the splendour of Versailles and the genuine cultural and diplomatic prestige Louis's own reign brought to French arms, French language and French fashion across the whole of Europe, a prestige so complete that French would remain the customary language of European diplomacy for well over a century after Louis's own death, was purchased at a price borne overwhelmingly by the kingdom's own ordinary peasantry, whose own taxation increased dramatically across the whole of Louis's own reign to fund both the palace's own construction and the army's own near-constant campaigning, and by the considerable number of French soldiers who died across 5 decades of intermittent warfare in conflicts whose own strategic objectives, a contested Flemish border town here, a disputed succession there, meant considerably less to the ordinary conscript actually dying in them than they meant to the king in whose name they were fought. It is worth pausing too on a specific and genuinely consequential religious decision Louis made in 1685, because it stands as one of the more troubling episodes of his own entire reign, and one this channel does not intend to pass over quietly. Louis, in that same year, formally revoked the Edict of Nantes, the religious settlement his own grandfather Henry IV had established nearly 90 years before, to guarantee France's own Protestant minority a measure of legal toleration, a revocation that stripped French Huguenots of their own previously guaranteed right to worship and drove a considerable number of them. Historians generally estimate somewhere in the range of 200,000 people into exile across Protestant Europe, a considerable loss of skilled craftsmen, merchants, and professionals whose own departure several modern economic historians regard as a genuine and lasting drain on French commercial and manufacturing capacity, and it is worth pausing on the specific irony this same decision represents. A Bourbon king undoing, in the name of religious uniformity, the single most celebrated act of religious pragmatism his own dynasty's own founder had ever performed. Exactly the kind of pattern this channel has traced before in other stories, a later generation forgetting, or deliberately discarding, the specific hard-won wisdom an earlier generation had actually paid for in blood. It is worth pausing too on the single most destructive individual campaign of Louis's own several decades of warfare, because during the 9 Years' War fought across much of the 1690s against a wide coalition of European powers, French forces, acting on Louis's own direct order, deliberately devastated the Palatinate, a German territory along the River Rhine, burning towns and castles across the whole region in a scorched earth policy intended to deny the advancing coalition armies any local resources to draw on. A campaign of calculated destruction that consumed cities including Heidelberg and Mannheim, and that left, by several surviving contemporary accounts, a bitterness among the German-speaking populations of the region that would echo, in French popular memory as much as German, for generations afterward, a specific and deliberate atrocity this channel does not intend to soften in the telling, because it stands as one of the clearest instances in this entire story of Bourbon glory, purchased through a policy whose own human cost fell entirely on people who had no part whatsoever in the original dynastic dispute that provoked it. A dying king in Madrid, and a will that would reshape the map of Europe. It is worth pausing now and turning our attention specifically to the single event, more than any other in this entire story, that actually transformed the House of Bourbon from a great and powerful royal family confined to a single kingdom into the multi-crowned dynasty this whole night's story has promised you. Because in the autumn of 1700, in a royal palace in Madrid, a physically frail and profoundly unwell king named Charles II of Spain, the last surviving male of the Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg, lay dying, without a single surviving child of his own, and without, in the entire senior line of his own extended Habsburg family, a single male heir close enough in blood and unencumbered enough by rival diplomatic considerations to inherit the whole of the vast Spanish Empire without triggering, in the process, exactly the kind of catastrophic European war that his own final decision would eventually help provoke regardless. It is worth pausing, at some length, on Charles II himself, because his own specific physical condition, a subject this channel finds genuinely worth treating with real and careful attention, rather than the crude mockery a great deal of popular history has historically reached for, actually explains a great deal about why his own reign ended in this exact crisis of succession. Charles suffered, across the whole of his own life, from a severe and complex combination of physical and developmental disabilities, generally attributed by modern medical historians to the extraordinarily concentrated degree of genetic inbreeding that nearly 3 centuries of deliberate intermarriage within the Spanish and Austrian branches of the House of Habsburg had produced. A dynasty that had, in its own repeated effort to keep the family's own vast inheritance concentrated within the bloodline, married first cousins and uncles to nieces with a frequency that modern genetics allows us to understand, with considerably more clarity than any contemporary observer actually possessed, as a direct and largely unavoidable cause of the severe infertility and the severe physical frailty that left Charles unable, across 2 separate marriages, to produce any surviving child of his own at all. It is worth pausing and naming plainly how directly this same specific genetic catastrophe of one royal house actually produced the specific dynastic opportunity of another, because Charles's own inability to produce an heir meant that the whole of the vast Spanish Empire, the Crown of Spain itself, and its own extensive possessions across Italy, the Low Countries, and the Americas would necessarily pass, at his own death, to whichever more distant relative Charles, or the diplomatic powers competing to influence his own final decision, actually chose to name, and it is worth pausing on the specific and genuinely difficult choice Charles ultimately made in the last weeks of his own life, naming, in his own final will, not any Habsburg cousin from the Austrian branch of his own extended family, the branch a great many observers had assumed would inherit by default, but Philip, Duke of Anjou, the second grandson of King Louis XIV of France, a Bourbon prince whose own French royal blood came through his own grandmother, a Spanish infanta who had married into the French royal house decades before. It is worth pausing too on why Charles actually made this same choice, because the surviving evidence suggests it reflected a genuine and considered judgment, shared by a considerable portion of the Spanish court itself, that a united Bourbon inheritance, keeping the whole of the vast Spanish Empire intact under a single new ruler rather than dividing it, as several rival diplomatic proposals had suggested, between competing Austrian and French claimants, offered Spain's own best hope of preserving its own empire's own territorial integrity, a preference for wholeness over partition that Charles apparently held with real personal conviction in the final months of his own painful decline, whatever the wider European consequences of that same preference would eventually turn out to be. It is worth pausing finally on how Louis XIV himself actually responded to this same extraordinary and genuinely unexpected windfall. Because Louis, presented with a will naming his own grandson heir to the entire Spanish Empire, accepted the inheritance on Philip's own behalf, reportedly declaring, in a remark whose own precise wording later generations have repeated with considerably more confidence than the surviving documentary record actually supports, that the Pyrenees, the mountain range that had traditionally divided France from Spain, no longer existed, a declaration of dynastic triumph that captured, with real accuracy regardless of its own exact phrasing, exactly how enormous a transformation this single inheritance actually represented. The House of Bourbon, a family that had held the French throne for barely a century, suddenly standing to inherit, through nothing more dramatic than an old and childless king's own final testamentary decision, the second great crown of Western Europe as well. A grand alliance and a war fought over the shape of an entire continent's own future. It is worth pausing now on the specific and genuinely enormous conflict this same inheritance actually provoked, because the other great powers of Europe, watching France and Spain move toward a combined Bourbon inheritance that threatened, in the judgment of nearly every rival capital, to upset the whole of the continent's own delicate balance of power, formed, within a remarkably short span of time, a grand alliance of England, the Dutch Republic, and the Austrian Habsburgs, specifically to prevent Philip's own Spanish inheritance from standing unchallenged, launching, in the process, the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would consume the whole of Western and Central Europe for the following 13 years, and that stands, alongside the 30 Years' War this channel has already described to you tonight, as one of the largest and most genuinely destructive conflicts the continent had yet produced. It is worth pausing at some length on the specific military course this same war actually took, because it is worth remembering throughout this next portion of the story that the aging Louis XIV, who had spent the whole of his own earlier reign accustomed to French military supremacy across the battlefields of Western Europe, found himself, in this final and most consequential conflict of his own life, facing an alliance commanded by military talents genuinely equal to, and in several documented instances superior to, anything French arms could actually put against them. The Duke of Marlborough, commanding the combined English and Allied forces, and Prince Eugene of Savoy, commanding the Austrian Habsburg armies, together inflicted on French and Bourbon Spanish forces a series of genuinely catastrophic defeats, at Blenheim in 1704, at Ramillies in 1706, and at Oudenarde in 1708, battles that this channel's audience should understand as considerably more decisive and considerably more damaging to French military prestige than any single defeat Louis's own armies had suffered across the whole of his own preceding 4 decades of near-continuous warfare. It is worth pausing and dwelling on the specific human cost these same battles actually exacted, because Blenheim alone, fought along the banks of the Danube in Bavaria in August of 1704, produced by most careful modern estimates somewhere in the range of 30,000 French and Bavarian casualties in a single day of fighting, a French army that had, at the war's own outset, seemed all but invincible to a considerable portion of Europe reduced, in the space of a single catastrophic afternoon, to a shattered and retreating remnant. And it is worth pausing too on the wider toll this same 13-year conflict imposed across every one of its own many theatres, in the Low Countries, in Italy, in Spain itself, and across the high seas of the Atlantic and Mediterranean, a toll that modern historians, working from admittedly incomplete contemporary records, generally estimate reached, across the whole span and the whole geographic breadth of the war, well over 400,000 deaths among soldiers and civilians alike. A human cost this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on, because it means the single dynastic inheritance this whole part of our story has been describing, a Bourbon prince quietly named heir to Spain in an old king's own private will, ultimately cost considerably more ordinary lives to actually secure in practice than it had ever cost Charles II himself to bestow on paper. It's worth pausing too on the specific and considerably more localised conflict this same war produced within Spain itself, because the War of the Spanish Succession was never merely a struggle among the great powers of Europe over Philip's own legitimacy, but also, within Spain's own borders, a genuine civil war between the Kingdom of Castile, which broadly supported Philip's own Bourbon succession, and the Kingdom of Aragon, including Catalonia specifically, which largely supported the rival Austrian Habsburg claimant, Archduke Charles. The division this channel's audience should understand reflected real and long-standing regional grievances within Spain's own composite monarchy, grievances over regional autonomy and regional privilege that the war's own dynastic dispute gave a fresh and considerably bloodier occasion to express, culminating in September of 1714 in the prolonged and eventually successful siege of Barcelona by Philip's own Bourbon forces, a siege whose own final storming several Catalan historical traditions still commemorate to this day as a foundational trauma of Catalan regional identity, a detail this channel believes deserves at least this brief and honest acknowledgement, because the establishment of Bourbon rule in Spain was never, for a great many of Philip's own new subjects, the peaceful and uncontested transition its own eventual diplomatic settlement made it appear in retrospect. It is worth pausing briefly on one further theatre of this same enormous war that popular memory has generally left considerably more obscure than Blenheim or Ramillies, because French and Bourbon Spanish forces, commanded for much of the conflict by the Duke of Vendôme, fought a long and grinding campaign across northern Italy against Austrian Habsburg armies commanded by the same Prince Eugene of Savoy, already devastating French arms further north. A campaign that produced no single battle as famous as the war's own more celebrated northern engagements, but that tied down considerable French and Spanish resources for years, and that ended, by 1707, in the effective loss of French and Bourbon Spanish influence across the whole of northern Italy, a considerably less dramatic but no less consequential defeat than any of the war's own more famous northern catastrophes, contributing its own share to the general and mounting pressure that would eventually force Louis XIV to the negotiating table at Utrecht. It is worth pausing too on the specific and prolonged siege of Lille in the autumn of 1708, because the fortress city, defended by a French garrison under Marshal Boufflers, held out for 4 full months against a considerably larger Allied besieging force, a defence so stubborn and so costly to the attacking coalition that it stands, alongside Villars' own later stand at Malplaquet, as one of the few genuinely creditable French military performances of this war's own otherwise dispiriting middle years, a reminder this channel finds worth pausing on, that even a war remembered on the whole as one of the great military humiliations of the entire Bourbon dynasty's own history still contained, scattered here and there among its own many defeats, individual episodes of real and stubborn French courage, a treaty that split one crown into 2 thrones forever. It is worth pausing now on the specific settlement that eventually ended this same enormous and enormously costly conflict, because the Peace of Utrecht, negotiated across a series of separate treaties, concluded in the Dutch city of that name in 1713, along with the subsequent Treaty of Rastatt the following year, represents one of the genuinely pivotal diplomatic settlements in the whole of European history, and it is worth pausing specifically on the single central compromise this same settlement actually achieved, because the assembled powers agreed to recognise Philip's own succession to the Spanish throne, ending at a diplomatic stroke the immediate crisis that had provoked the whole war, but only on the specific and carefully enforced condition that the crowns of France and Spain would remain permanently and irrevocably separate, Philip formally renouncing on his own behalf, and on behalf of all his own future descendants, any future claim to the French throne, a renunciation this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on, because it represents the exact opposite of what a great many observers at the war's own outset had feared, not a single unified Bourbon superpower straddling both France and Spain under one crown, but 2 entirely separate and permanently divided Bourbon monarchies, related by blood and, as we'll see in a few minutes, increasingly bound together by deliberate treaty and alliance, but never again to be formally united under the rule of any single king. It is worth pausing too on the considerable additional price Spain itself paid within this same broader settlement to actually secure Philip's own recognised succession, because the Peace of Utrecht required Spain to cede a substantial portion of its own long-held European territories to satisfy the wider alliance's own demand for compensation, the Spanish Netherlands and the Spanish possessions in Italy, Naples, Sicily, Milan, and Sardinia among them, passing to Austrian Habsburg control, while Britain secured, for its own part, the strategic Mediterranean outposts of Gibraltar and Minorca, along with a valuable and long-coveted trading concession, the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spain's own American colonies, a specific provision this channel does not intend to pass over without at least naming plainly, since the human cost of this single diplomatic settlement extended in ways the treaty's own celebratory language never once acknowledged, considerably beyond the battlefield casualties this channel has already described to you tonight, into the transatlantic slave trade, whose own continued and expanding operation this same peace treaty explicitly protected and expanded for the specific commercial benefit of the victorious alliance. It is worth pausing finally on what Philip V actually inherited, once the dust of this 13-year war had genuinely settled, because even a Spain stripped of its own Italian and Low Countries possessions remained, in 1713, one of the largest and most valuable empires the world had ever seen, encompassing the whole of Spain itself, along with the vast Spanish territories across Mexico, Central America, most of South America, and the Philippines, a domain of such extraordinary scale that Philip's own accession to it, however diminished from the empire Charles II had originally intended to bequeath, still represented for the House of Bourbon as a whole, an accumulation of dynastic power that no single European royal family had matched since the days of Charles V's own combined Habsburg inheritance nearly 2 centuries before, a family that had begun this entire story as an obscure and overlooked cadet branch of French nobility, now standing, in the persons of 2 separate reigning kings, at the head of both of Western Europe's own 2 greatest crowns at once. It is worth pausing briefly on the single winter that came closest to ending the whole war, and very nearly France itself, before Utrecht ever settled anything, because the winter of 1709, remembered across French history as the Great Frost, brought a cold so severe and so prolonged that rivers froze solid across the whole of the kingdom, seed grain froze in the ground before it could even be planted, and the resulting famine layered on top of a kingdom already exhausted by 8 years of continuous warfare and taxation, killed, by several modern estimates, hundreds of thousands of ordinary French people in a single terrible season, a catastrophe severe enough that Louis XIV, by this point genuinely humbled by a run of military defeats and a treasury reduced to actual insolvency, made a formal appeal directly to his own French subjects, an unprecedented admission of royal vulnerability from a king who had spent the whole of his own preceding reign cultivating an image of untouchable and God-given majesty. It is worth pausing, too, on how France's own military fortunes actually recovered, if only partially, from this same low point, because Marshal Villars, commanding what remained of Louis's own exhausted army, fought the Allied coalition to a bloody standstill at Malplaquet in September of 1709, a battle that cost the attacking Allies considerably more casualties than it cost the defending French, and then, 3 years later, at Denain, in July of 1712, won a genuine and unexpected French victory that considerably strengthened Louis's own negotiating position in the peace talks already underway at Utrecht, a reminder this channel finds worth pausing on, that even a war as thoroughly and as repeatedly disastrous for French arms as this one had been could still turn, in its own final and exhausted months, on the strength of a single capable commander's own last successful campaign. A king's own death, and a nephew who gambled an entire kingdom's own finances on a paper scheme. It is worth pausing, before we turn to the specific expansion of Bourbon power into Italy, on the death of Louis XIV himself, because the Sun King finally died on the 1st of September, 1715, at the age of 76, having outlived his own son, his own eldest grandson, and all but one of his own great-grandsons, so that the throne passed to a 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV, under the regency of Louis's own nephew, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, a transition this channel's audience will already recognise as exactly the kind of dangerous royal minority that had produced such genuine crisis twice already in this same story, during Louis XIII's own childhood and during Louis XIV's own. It is worth pausing at some length on the specific financial catastrophe this same regency actually produced, because Philippe, inheriting a kingdom whose own treasury, Louis's own decades of warfare had left in genuine ruin, turned to a Scottish financier named John Law, who proposed an ambitious scheme to replace the kingdom's own scarce hard currency with paper banknotes backed by shares in a trading company holding an exclusive monopoly over French commerce with Louisiana in North America, a scheme that produced, across 1719 and the opening months of 1720, a genuine speculative frenzy among French investors convinced the Mississippi Territories concealed vast and untapped mineral wealth, share prices rising to levels bearing no realistic relationship to the company's own actual and considerably more modest colonial revenues, before the whole scheme collapsed, in the course of 1720, in a catastrophic crash that wiped out the paper fortunes of a great many French investors virtually overnight, and left the Regency's own already fragile public finances in a state several modern economic historians regard as considerably worse than before Law's own scheme had ever been attempted. A specific and genuinely instructive episode this channel finds worth naming plainly, because it demonstrates how directly the accumulated cost of Louis XIV's own glory continued to burden his own successor's own government for years after the Sun King's own death had already been mourned and commemorated. A widow determined that her own sons would each wear a crown of their own. It is worth pausing now and turning our attention to a woman whose own ambition and whose own persistent diplomatic manoeuvring did more than any other single individual's efforts to actually extend the House of Bourbon's own reach beyond the 2 crowns it had already secured in France and Spain, because Philip V's own second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, whom he married in 1714 following the death of his own first wife, brought to the Spanish court a specific and unrelenting dynastic project. This channel finds genuinely worth pausing on, a determination pursued across the whole of the following 3.5 decades, that her own children, sons who stood, under the specific succession arrangements already established for the Spanish crown, behind their own elder Bourbon half-brothers in line for the throne of Spain itself, would nonetheless each inherit a genuine sovereign crown of their own, somewhere on the map of Europe, whatever diplomatic and military effort it actually took to secure it. It is worth pausing on how genuinely formidable a political operator Elizabeth Farnese actually proved to be in pursuit of this same goal, because she is, by the assessment of a great many modern historians of the period, one of the single most consequential and most underappreciated dynastic strategists of the entire 18th century, a queen who exercised, across the whole of her own husband's reign and considerably beyond it, a degree of genuine influence over Spanish foreign policy that several contemporary diplomats regarded, with a mixture of admiration and real alarm, as considerably exceeding the influence of Philip's own official ministers, directing Spain's own diplomatic and military resources again and again across these same decades, towards securing Italian territory specifically for her own eldest son, a boy named Charles, born in 1716. It is worth pausing briefly on the first and considerably less successful attempt Elizabeth Farnese made to advance this same project, because in 1717 and 1718, only a few years into her own marriage, she persuaded Philip to launch a Spanish military expedition to seize Sardinia and then Sicily, territories Spain had only recently ceded under the Peace of Utrecht. a gamble that provoked the other great powers into forming the Quadruple Alliance specifically to reverse it, a coalition whose own combined naval and military strength forced Spain, within little more than a year, into a humiliating withdrawal and a formal renunciation of the very Italian ambitions Elizabeth had only just begun to pursue, a defeat this channel finds worth naming plainly, because it shows how many failed attempts this same patient and eventually successful maternal project actually required before it finally bore fruit a decade and a half later in the War of the Polish Succession. It is worth pausing too, and at some real length, on the specific personal affliction that shadowed Philip V across the whole of the middle and later decades of his own reign, because it is one of the more genuinely difficult and genuinely human episodes in this entire story. Philip suffered, from at least the early 1720s onward, from what modern medical historians generally describe as a severe and recurring depressive illness, marked by episodes of profound melancholy, physical lethargy, and, by several contemporary accounts, a specific and consuming religious anxiety over the state of his own soul, a condition serious enough that in January of 1724, Philip did something no reigning Spanish monarch had ever done before, formally abdicating his own throne in favour of his own eldest son, who reigned briefly as Louis I of Spain, an abdication several contemporary observers believed reflected Philip's own genuine wish to retreat from the burdens of kingship into a life of private religious contemplation. It is worth pausing and dwelling on how briefly this same arrangement actually lasted, because Louis I died of smallpox only 7 months into his own reign, at just 17 years old, a sudden and genuinely tragic death that left Spain, once again, without an adult sovereign on its own throne, and that forced Philip, his own depression notwithstanding, to resume the crown he had so recently and so deliberately set down, a reversal Philip appears to have accepted with real personal reluctance, spending a great deal of his own remaining reign, by several surviving accounts, in a state of considerable psychological distress, at times refusing to change his own clothes or leave his own bed for days at a stretch. A burden Elizabeth Farnese herself is generally credited by modern historians with managing, across these same difficult years, with real skill and real personal patience, effectively directing the practical business of Spanish government around her own husband's own recurring incapacity, a specific and largely unglamorous form of political labour. This channel finds genuinely worth setting, alongside her own more celebrated dynastic diplomacy. It is worth pausing at some length on the specific sequence of conflicts and diplomatic settlements this same maternal ambition actually produced, because the War of the Polish Succession, fought across the years 1733 to 1738, ostensibly a dispute over who would occupy the Polish throne, but functioning, in practice, as a considerably wider contest among the great powers over territorial adjustments across the whole of Western and Central Europe, ended with a settlement that granted Elizabeth Farnese's own son, Charles, the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, together generally known as the Two Sicilies, a genuine and sovereign crown Charles received in 1734, at only 18 years old, becoming the first monarch to rule Naples and Sicily, as an independent kingdom in its own right rather than as a mere possession of some larger and more distant power, a specific and genuinely popular innovation among a great many of his own new Neapolitan subjects, who had spent the preceding decades ruled from Vienna or from Madrid by viceroys, answerable to a monarch who had never once set foot in the kingdom he governed. It is worth pausing, at some length, on the specific and genuinely substantial reign Charles actually built for himself across the following quarter century as King of Naples and Sicily, because it stands, this channel believes, as one of the more admirable individual chapters in this entire dynastic story. Charles commissioned, beginning in 1752, an enormous new royal palace at Caserta, some miles outside Naples itself, explicitly modelled in its own scale and its own ambition on Versailles, a project intended, in real and specific rivalry with the French branch of his own family, to demonstrate that the Neapolitan Bourbon line could match its own Parisian cousins in architectural and cultural grandeur, and he oversaw, beginning in 1738, the first systematic excavations of the buried Roman towns of Herculaneum, and, from 1748 onward, Pompeii itself, cities that had lain undisturbed beneath volcanic ash from Vesuvius's own eruption some 17 centuries before, excavations that recovered an extraordinary wealth of Roman art, sculpture, and everyday domestic material, and that did more than any single project of this era to transform the whole of Europe's own scholarly and artistic understanding of the ancient classical world, drawing wealthy and educated travellers from across the whole continent to Naples, specifically to view these same discoveries. A genuine cultural legacy this channel finds considerably more admirable than most of the purely dynastic accomplishments this story has otherwise had to describe to you tonight. It is worth pausing, too, on the specific natural disaster Charles's own kingdom endured only a few years before his own arrival, because a severe earthquake struck the Neapolitan province of Foggia in March of 1731, killing several thousand people and destroying a considerable number of towns across the region. A catastrophe that had already left the kingdom, Charles inherited 3 years later, considerably poorer and considerably more fragile than its own celebrated cultural flowering under his own subsequent rule might otherwise suggest. A reminder this channel finds worth pausing on, that even the most genuinely constructive individual reign this whole story has described to you was still built, as every kingdom in this story eventually is, on a foundation of ordinary human suffering that the kingdom's own later cultural glories rarely bother to fully acknowledge. It is worth pausing too on the second and considerably smaller Italian territory this same maternal project eventually secured, because the Duchy of Parma, along with the neighbouring duchies of Piacenza and Guastalla, passed, following further diplomatic negotiation and further armed conflict across the 1740s, to Elizabeth Farnese's own younger son, another Philip, who established, in 1748, an entirely separate and entirely independent Bourbon-Parma line, a comparatively modest inheritance next to his own elder brother's kingdom of the two Sicilies, but a genuine sovereign crown nonetheless, achieved through exactly the same patient, decades-long maternal persistence that had already secured Naples and Sicily a decade and a half before. It is worth pausing briefly on the specific war that actually delivered this second Italian crown, because the War of the Austrian Succession, fought across the whole of the 1740s over the right of the Habsburg heiress Maria Theresa to inherit her own father's vast domains, drew in nearly every major power of Europe in shifting and often opportunistic combinations, and gave Elizabeth Farnese, watching from Madrid, exactly the kind of wider continental confusion her own patient diplomacy had already exploited once before during the Polish succession crisis. A fresh opportunity to press her own younger son's own claim to an Italian duchy, a claim the eventual Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 finally confirmed, closing, in the process, the last of the major wars this same relentless maternal project would ever actually require to complete its own decades-long design. It is worth pausing too on the specific and genuinely bloody battle fought on Bourbon Parma's own native soil only a few years before this same settlement, because at Velletri, south of Rome, in August of 1744, Bourbon Neapolitan forces under the young King Charles himself narrowly avoided capture in a surprise Austrian night attack on his own headquarters, escaping in his own nightshirt by several accounts, a genuinely undignified brush with disaster for a king whose own kingdom of Naples had, by this point in the story, existed as an independent Bourbon crown for barely a decade, and a reminder this channel finds worth pausing on that even the two Italian crowns this whole story has already described to you as comparatively bloodless dynastic acquisitions still required, in their own specific defence, real battles fought by real soldiers who had no more say in the matter than any other ordinary conscript, this story has already asked you to remember tonight. A family that married outward as patiently as it married within itself. It's worth pausing briefly before we turn to Louis XV's own reign specifically on how much of this family's own accumulated influence across Europe by the middle of the 1700s actually extended well beyond the 4 sovereign crowns this story has already counted for you. Because the House of Bourbon, across these same decades, also married its own daughters and its own sons outward into a considerable number of other reigning European houses, weaving a web of family connection that gave Bourbon influence a reach considerably wider than its own directly ruled territory alone. Louis XV's own daughters and Louis XV's own extended cousins married into the ruling houses of Savoy, of Parma's own neighbouring Italian states, and of Spain's own Two Sicilies branch. Married back into the senior Spanish line more than once across these same decades. A pattern of careful and repeated intermarriage this channel finds worth naming plainly, because it means the specific and considerable prestige of being connected to the House of Bourbon, by blood extended, by the middle of the 1700s, into royal courts and royal nurseries across the whole of Western and Southern Europe, well beyond the 4 thrones this family actually and directly occupied. It is worth pausing, too, on how deliberately this same policy of outward marriage actually served the specific and practical diplomatic interests of whichever Bourbon court happened to be arranging it, because a Bourbon princess married into the House of Savoy, for instance, gave France or Spain a direct and ongoing channel of family influence over a strategically vital Alpine buffer state, positioned exactly between French and Austrian territory, a form of soft diplomatic leverage this channel's audience. Familiar by now with how much of this whole story has depended on the ordinary accidents of marriage and inheritance, will recognise as simply the same underlying dynastic logic that built this whole family's own 4 crowns in the first place, applied now on a smaller and more routine scale to the ordinary daily business of maintaining influence over a continent already saturated by the middle of the 1700s, with this single family's own considerable presence, a cardinal tutor's own quiet decade, and a young king who preferred hunting to governing. It is worth pausing briefly before we follow the family compacts themselves on the reign of Louis XV in France across these same middle decades of the 1700s, because the great-grandson who had inherited Louis XIV's own throne as a 5-year-old child grew, across his own long minority and beyond it, into a monarch considerably less personally engaged with the daily business of government than either his own great-grandfather or the celebrated cardinal ministers this story has already described to you tonight. For the better part of Louis XV's own early adult reign, actual governance rested largely in the hands of Cardinal Fleury, his own former childhood tutor, who guided France across a ministry lasting from 1726 until his own death in 1743 at the age of 89. With a caution and a fiscal restraint several modern historians regard as a genuinely necessary corrective to the reckless overextension of Louis XIV's own final decades, restoring French public credit and French diplomatic standing considerably, before dying at genuinely advanced age on the very eve of a fresh continental war, the War of the Austrian Succession, that would once again draw France into the kind of expensive and only partially rewarding foreign conflict Fleury had spent his own long ministry so carefully trying to avoid. It is worth pausing and being honest about Louis XV's own personal reputation among a great many of his own French subjects, because a king who devoted a considerable portion of his own adult life to hunting, and to a long and well-documented sequence of royal mistresses, Madame de Pompadour chief among them, a woman who exercised, across nearly 2 decades at court, a degree of genuine political influence over French cultural and even diplomatic policy that several contemporaries found remarkable for a royal mistress rather than a queen, came to be remembered by French popular opinion across the whole of his own long reign, with a warmth considerably cooler than the affection Henry IV had once inspired, and it is worth naming plainly, here at this specific point in the story, that the specific reserves of royal popularity Henry IV had built up at this dynasty's own founding had, by the middle of the 1700s, worn down considerably, an erosion of royal goodwill. This channel finds worth remembering because it forms part of the same slow accumulation of grievance that would eventually, within a few decades of this story's own close, bring the whole French branch of this dynasty to its own well-known and catastrophic end, a family bound by treaty as tightly as by blood. It is worth pausing now on the specific diplomatic architecture the various branches of this now considerably expanded royal family actually constructed to bind themselves together across the middle decades of the 1700s, because the so-called family compacts, a series of formal alliance treaties concluded between Bourbon France and Bourbon Spain in 1733, 1743, and, in their own most comprehensive and most consequential form, 1761, represent a genuinely deliberate attempt to translate this whole family's own shared blood into a coordinated instrument of continental and even global strategic power, committing the two kingdoms to mutual military support against their own common rivals, chief among them Great Britain, whose own growing naval and commercial dominance across the Atlantic world the various Bourbon courts regarded, with considerable and largely justified anxiety, as the single greatest long-term threat to their own family's own combined imperial fortunes. It is worth pausing and being honest about how unevenly these same compacts actually performed in practice, because the third and most ambitious family compact, concluded in 1761 specifically to draw Spain into France's own already faltering war effort against Britain in the conflict known to English-speaking history as the 7 Years' War, arrived by most careful modern military assessments considerably too late and considerably too weakly resourced to actually reverse the already decisive British advantage in that same global conflict. A war that had already cost France the greater part of its own North American empire and a considerable portion of its own Indian trading interest before Spain's own belated entry, under the compact's own terms, added little beyond the loss of Havana and Manila to British expeditionary forces before the war's own final settlement. A sobering reminder this channel finds genuinely worth pausing on, that a family bound as tightly by treaty and by blood as the various branches of the House of Bourbon had become by the 1760s could still, for all its own accumulated crowns and all its own accumulated territory, prove considerably less effective in actual coordinated action than its own sheer dynastic scale might have led a casual observer of the period to expect. A single family wearing 4 crowns at once, it is worth pausing at real length on the specific moment this whole long accumulation of dynastic fortune actually reached its own genuine peak. Because in 1759, Charles, the same son of Elizabeth Farnese who had ruled Naples and Sicily since 1734, inherited, on the death of his own elder half-brother Ferdinand VI, the throne of Spain itself, becoming King Charles III of Spain, and passing his own former kingdom of the two Sicilies on to his own younger son Ferdinand, establishing, in that single transfer, an entirely separate and permanently independent branch of the Bourbon family on the Neapolitan throne. And it is worth pausing and simply naming plainly exactly what this same sequence of inheritances had actually produced by this specific year. Because the House of Bourbon, a family that had begun this whole story as a peripheral cadet branch of French nobility, with no realistic prospect of any throne at all, now sat simultaneously on the throne of France itself, on the throne of Spain and its own vast American and Pacific empire, on the throne of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and on the ducal throne of Parma. 4 separate and formally sovereign crowns held by 4 separate branches of a single extended family. An accumulation of direct royal power that no other dynasty in the whole of contemporary Europe, not the Habsburgs, not the Hohenzollerns, not the Romanovs, could actually match at this same specific historical moment, and it is this same extraordinary accumulation, achieved not through any single grand and unified strategy, but through nearly 2 centuries of accident, marriage, war, treaty, and one persistent and patient mother's own decades-long ambition that entitles the House of Bourbon, by the middle years of the 1700s, to the specific title this whole story has promised you from its very first sentence: Europe's most powerful royal dynasty. It is worth pausing briefly on how the other courts of Europe actually reacted to this same moment, because the accession of Charles III to the Spanish throne in 1759, arriving as it did only 3 years into the enormous global conflict of the 7 Years' War, and only 2 years before the third and most comprehensive family compact would formally bind France and Spain's own military resources together, was watched by the diplomatic correspondence surviving from Vienna, from London, and from St. Petersburg alike. With a genuine and considerable anxiety, rival courts recognising, in the specific person of a single 63-year-old king now presiding through his own direct rule and his own family's own extended branches, over France, Spain, the two Sicilies, and Parma all at once, exactly the kind of concentrated dynastic power no other single European family could presently match, an anxiety this channel finds worth naming plainly, because it confirms, from the outside and in the words of this family's own rivals, rather than merely in the celebratory language of its own court chroniclers, exactly how genuinely dominant the House of Bourbon's own position had actually become by the middle of the 1700s, a river that waters many fields and sometimes floods them too. It is worth pausing now, before we turn to the reflections this channel always likes to close on, to return to the specific image this whole story opened with tonight, because we can now, having followed the whole course of this family's own remarkable rise, say something considerably more precise about how that same image actually applies. A single, narrow spring, rising in the obscure and overlooked territory of a younger son's younger son, forked, across 3 centuries, into a river considerably wider and considerably more consequential than anyone standing at its own source could ever reasonably have predicted, watering, by the time of its own fullest and widest flow, the palace at Versailles and the palace at Madrid and the royal residences at Naples and at Parma all at once. And it is worth pausing too on the specific and considerably less comfortable half of that same river metaphor, because a river this wide and this powerful does not merely nourish the fields it happens to pass through, it also floods them, on occasion catastrophically, and this channel does not believe a fair accounting of the House of Bourbon's own rise can honestly close, without naming plainly exactly how much flooding, how much genuine human devastation actually accompanied this family's own extraordinary and largely accidental accumulation of crowns. It is worth pausing and counting, so far as any honest accounting can actually be made across nearly 2 centuries and across 4 separate wars of genuinely staggering scale, the specific human cost this whole story has actually described to you tonight. The French wars of religion that first brought Henry of Navarre to his own improbable throne, killed, across their own 36 years of intermittent fighting, somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 million French people, by the more considered modern estimates. A toll that includes not merely the battlefield dead, but the far larger number who perished from the famine and the disease that any prolonged civil conflict of this scale inevitably produces across an agricultural society already stretched thin by war's own ordinary disruption of planting and of harvest. The 30 Years' War that Cardinal Richelieu deliberately drew France into, for reasons of pure state interest rather than religious conviction, killed, across the whole of Central Europe, a toll modern historians generally place somewhere between 4 and 8 million people, a demographic catastrophe from which several regions of the German land specifically did not fully recover in population for the better part of a century afterward. The War of the Spanish Succession that actually secured the Bourbon crown of Spain cost, as this channel has already told you tonight, somewhere in the range of 400,000 lives across its own 13 years and its own many scattered theatres of fighting. And the 7 Years' War that the final and most ambitious family compact tried, largely unsuccessfully, to help France win, added a further toll modern historians estimate at somewhere between 900,000 and 1.5 million deaths across its own genuinely global span of fighting, from the forests of North America to the plains of India to the battlefields of Central Europe itself. It is worth pausing and adding all of that together honestly, rather than passing quickly over the sum the way a story fixed only on royal marriages and royal coronations might be tempted to do, because the specific and considerable grandeur this whole night's story has described to you, the Palace of Versailles, the double monarchy of France and Spain, the 4 crowns gathered onto 4 related heads by the middle of the 1700s, was purchased across the whole span of this story by a human cost that very plausibly exceeds 10 million lives, soldiers and peasants and ordinary townspeople alike, the overwhelming majority of whom left behind, in the surviving historical record, no name, no individual account of their own specific death, and no share whatsoever in the glory their own suffering had helped to build. Voices from the ranks, so far as anything of them survives at all. It is worth pausing now on the handful of ordinary people whose own specific traces do survive somewhere within this enormous and mostly anonymous accumulation of dynastic history, not because they matter more than the millions whose own names none of the surviving chronicles ever thought worth recording, but because a story told entirely in the register of kings and treaties risks letting its own listener forget that every single one of those kings and every single one of those treaties was paid for, in the most literal and the most physical sense, by ordinary people who woke up on an ordinary morning and made an ordinary explicable decision that this whole enormous dynastic project eventually swallowed. Consider for a moment the ordinary Huguenot weaver, or ordinary Huguenot merchant of La Rochelle, a man or woman whose own name has not survived in any source this channel has been able to find, who lived through Richelieu's own 14-month siege of that same city in 1627 and 1628. Watching the specific and deliberately constructed seawall this channel has already described to you slowly starve an entire community that had once imagined itself protected, by treaty and by distance from Paris alike, from exactly this kind of royal retribution, a person who very possibly did not survive that same siege at all, since contemporary estimates suggest the city's own population fell across the course of the blockade from something in the range of 27,000 people to considerably fewer than half that number, the difference made up almost entirely of ordinary residents who simply starved. Consider, too, the ordinary French conscript who marched, at some point across Louis XIV's own 5 decades of near-continuous warfare, into one of the several wars this channel has already described to you tonight, a young man drawn from some anonymous French village, trained briefly and inadequately in the tactics of a professional 18th century army, and sent to fight, and very possibly to die in a Flemish field or a German river valley over some specific dynastic or territorial dispute. He almost certainly did not fully understand, and had no realistic say whatsoever in choosing one soldier among the hundreds of thousands whose own collective and largely anonymous suffering actually funded, through the taxation and the conscription that supported it, the entire glittering edifice of Versailles this story has already described to you in some detail. Consider too the ordinary Palatine villager who watched, in the summer or autumn of some specific year in the early 1690s, this channel's surviving sources do not allow us to fix with any precision, French soldiers arrive in his or her own town with orders to burn it, a man or woman whose own home, whose own church and whose own accumulated harvest for that same year existed for no other reason than to be denied, under Louis XIV's own direct instruction, to an advancing coalition army that would very likely never have passed through that same particular village at all. An ordinary person whose own specific suffering this channel's surviving sources reduce, almost without exception, to a single anonymous line in a wider tally of towns destroyed, rather than to any individually recorded name or any individually recorded loss. Consider too the ordinary French labourer conscripted from his own regiment to help dig the canals and haul the stone of Versailles' own gardens, a man whose own daily wage when he in fact received one at all, came from the very same royal treasury his own conscript's pay as a soldier would otherwise have drawn, and whose own considerable and largely uncounted risk of death by disease or by simple construction accident purchased, for the kingdom that employed him, a garden this channel's audience may well have seen photographed in some travel article or some school textbook, without ever once learning the name of a single person who actually dug it. Consider, finally, the ordinary Neapolitan subject who watched, in 1734, an 18-year-old Spanish-born prince named Charles arrive to claim the throne of a kingdom that had, for the whole of that same subject's own lifetime, been ruled from some distant foreign capital by an absentee monarch who had never once set foot in Naples itself. A moment of genuine and, by several surviving contemporary accounts, genuinely enthusiastic popular welcome this channel finds worth naming plainly, because it reminds us that not every single consequence of this whole family's own dynastic accumulation was purchased at the ordinary subject's own direct expense, that a Bourbon king who actually resided in his own kingdom, and who took, as Charles III of Naples and later of Spain genuinely did, across the whole of his own long reign, a considerable and well-documented personal interest in practical administrative reform, in public infrastructure, and in the material welfare of his own ordinary subjects, could represent, for at least some of the people who found themselves living under this family's own expanding rule, a genuine and tangible improvement over what had come before, both hands held open at once. It is worth pausing now on a specific discipline this channel has always tried to practice in telling you these stories, the discipline of holding both hands open at the same time, refusing to let a single tidy verdict, hero or villain, settle over people and events that the actual surviving evidence simply does not allow us to judge quite so cleanly. And this particular story, a story of one family's own patient and largely improvised climb from genealogical obscurity to the summit of European royal power, rewards that same discipline as thoroughly as any story this channel has ever told you. Consider Henry IV with both hands open at once. In one hand, a genuinely beloved king who ended 36 years of religious civil war through an act of pragmatic religious toleration, considerably more generous than most of his own royal contemporaries would ever have extended, who rebuilt a shattered kingdom's own finances and infrastructure with real and well-documented personal attention to the material welfare of his own ordinary peasant subjects, and who survived, through sheer personal resilience, a massacre that killed thousands of his own co-religionists around him. In the other hand, a man who converted his own deepest religious convictions not once but twice under the most naked and unsentimental political calculation, who abandoned, for his own throne's sake, the specific Protestant faith his own mother had raised him in with such fierce personal conviction, and whose own famous remark about Paris being worth a mass, whatever its exact wording, captures a man for whom personal survival and personal advancement mattered, in the final accounting, considerably more than any fixed and unwavering religious principle ever did. Both of those descriptions are true of the same man at the same time, and this channel does not think you are served well by a version of this story that keeps only one of them. Consider Louis XIV with both hands open at once. In one hand, a monarch whose own extraordinary 72-year reign, the longest of any monarch in recorded European history, brought French culture, French language, and French diplomatic prestige to a height no single kingdom would match again for well over a century, who successfully tamed a French nobility whose own earlier rebellions had nearly toppled his own childhood regency, and whose own patient dynastic diplomacy eventually secured, through his own grandson's own inheritance, the second great throne of Western Europe for his own family. In the other hand, a king whose own near-constant warfare taxed an already burdened French peasantry to a degree several modern historians directly connect to the eventual and far more catastrophic revolution that would consume his own great-great-great-grandson's own throne some 7 decades after Louis's own death. and whose own revocation of his own grandfather's most celebrated act of religious tolerance drove 200,000 of his own most skilled and most productive subjects into permanent foreign exile in the specific name of a religious uniformity. His own reign never actually needed to enforce at all. Both of those descriptions are true of the same man at the same time, and this channel does not think a story built only from the first of them, the glittering Sun King of popular legend, would actually be telling you the truth. Consider Elizabeth Farnese with both hands open at once. In one hand, a genuinely remarkable and genuinely underappreciated political strategist, a stepmother's own stepdaughter by marriage, who nonetheless secured, through patient diplomacy pursued across 3.5 decades, 2 entirely separate sovereign crowns for her own 2 sons, an achievement of pure dynastic persistence. This channel finds genuinely admirable on its own specific terms in an era when a queen's own political influence, however genuinely exercised, was so rarely acknowledged with anything like the credit a king pursuing the identical strategy would automatically have received. In the other hand, a woman whose own single-minded pursuit of crowns for her own children helped draw Spain into wars, the War of the Polish Succession chief among them, whose own connection to Spain's own actual national interest was, by the honest assessment of a great many contemporary and modern observers alike, considerably more tenuous than the connection to one mother's own very personal ambition for her own 2 favoured sons. Both of those descriptions are true of the same woman at the same time, and this channel would rather hold them both open than collapse her own genuinely complicated legacy into either a simple portrait of maternal devotion or a simple portrait of reckless ambition. Consider Cardinal Richelieu with both hands open at once. In one hand, a genuinely brilliant statesman whose own patient dismantling of an overmighty and repeatedly rebellious French nobility, and whose own construction of a professional royal bureaucracy answerable to the crown rather than to any private feudal loyalty, gave the young Louis XIV the stable and centralised instrument of government that made his own later absolutism actually workable in practice, an institutional achievement whose own basic shape would outlast the Bourbon monarchy itself and survive, in recognisable form, into the modern French state. In the other hand, a churchman who starved an entire city's own civilian population into surrender at La Rochelle without any apparent private hesitation, who drew Catholic France into a bloody European war against fellow Catholic powers for reasons of pure dynastic advantage rather than any principle he himself would likely have described as more elevated than that, and whose own ruthless suppression of noble descent, however necessary it may have been to French royal stability, still cost a considerable number of individual noblemen, Cinq-Mars among them, their own lives for conspiracies that a less centralising and less absolute monarchy might never have provoked in the first place. Both of those descriptions are true of the same man at the same time, and this channel does not think a story that remembers Richelieu only as the founder of the Académie Française, or only as the tyrant of La Rochelle, would actually be telling you the whole of who he was. A law this channel keeps finding no matter which century it visits. It is worth pausing now on the specific pattern this whole story has traced for you across the preceding several hours, because it is a variation on a pattern this channel has identified before, in other centuries and in other kinds of catastrophe, and it bears repeating plainly here, at the heart of tonight's reflection, in the specific form this story of dynastic accumulation actually gives it. The rise of a great royal house, quite as much as the collapse of a besieged city or the failure of a continental crusade, is almost never the product of any single mind's own deliberate and far-sighted design, however tidy and however inevitable that same rise inevitably looks in the hindsight of a later century's own popular retelling. It is instead assembled piece by piece out of a long chain of individually contingent accidents and individually reasonable decisions, a younger son granted a modest inheritance because primogeniture required it, a senior branch of the family disgraced and extinguished through one man's own personal grievance and one man's own act of treason, a queen mother raising her own son on a specific and unusually rigorous philosophy of practical kingship, a wedding meant to end a religious war instead becoming the occasion for one of that same war's own worst massacres, a childless king's own final and genuinely considered testamentary choice, a determined mother's own 3.5-decade campaign to secure sovereign thrones for children who stood behind their own half-brothers in the ordinary line of inheritance. Nobody, at any single decision point across this entire 2-century story, actually sat down and designed the specific four-crowned outcome this whole night's telling has described to you. Every single person involved was, by the ordinary light of their own available information and their own immediate ambitions, making the decision that seemed, to them, at that specific moment, like the sound and sensible one, or, in a great many of this story's own more violent episodes, simply the decision that offered the best available chance of personal survival, and it was only the accumulation of all of those individually contingent choices, layered one upon another across nearly 200 years, that produced an outcome not one of them, taken alone, could ever have fully foreseen or fully intended. It is worth pausing too on how this same law applies with particular force to the specific religious and military catastrophes woven through this whole story, because the wars of religion did not begin in 1562, because any single French Catholic or any single French Protestant sat down and decided in cold and deliberate malice to plunge the kingdom into 36 years of intermittent slaughter, but because a long accumulation of individually reasonable grievances, a nobility resentful of the crown's own centralising ambitions, a Protestant minority reasonably alarmed by the prospect of losing its own hard-won legal protections, a Catholic majority reasonably alarmed by the prospect of a heretic king, hardened, decision by decision and massacre by massacre, into a conflict none of its own original participants could have fully foreseen at its own outset. The same pattern holds for the War of the Spanish Succession, provoked not by any single power's own deliberate wish for 13 years of continental slaughter, but by a dying king's own genuinely considered attempt to preserve his own empire's own integrity, met by a coalition of rival powers, each pursuing its own entirely reasonable calculation of its own national interest, an accumulation of individually defensible choices that produced, in their own combination, one of the costliest wars Europe had yet seen, a river that would eventually run dry, in a story for another night. It is worth pausing before we let this whole story settle fully into the past where it belongs, on where this same extraordinary accumulation of Bourbon power would eventually lead, because this channel does not intend tonight to tell you the story of how it all came undone. A story involving a besieged fortress in Paris called the Bastille, a guillotine in a public square this channel may one night describe to you in its own full and difficult detail, and the eventual and considerably more gradual ends met by the Spanish and the Neapolitan branches of this same family across the 19th and 20th centuries that followed, but it is worth naming plainly, here at the close of tonight's telling, that the very same accumulation of absolute royal power this story has spent so many hours describing to you, the taxation that built Versailles, the wars that secured Spain and Naples and Parma, the court ritual that tamed a once rebellious nobility into ornamental dependency, planted, in the process of its own construction, a great many of the specific grievances that would eventually bring the French branch of this same family to its own catastrophic and considerably more famous end. A story, this channel suspects, it may well tell you in full, one long night still to come. How we actually know any of this? It is worth pausing, before we settle into the longer reflections this channel always likes to close a night on, to explain where a story with this much specific human detail, a queen raising her own son barefoot in the Pyrenees, a king's own possibly apocryphal remark about a mass being worth a city, an 18-year-old prince arriving by ship to claim a kingdom he had never once visited, actually comes from. Because the honest answer, as with every story this channel has told you before, is a scattered and unevenly preserved handful of memoirs, diplomatic correspondence and court records, each produced by a specific person with a specific set of loyalties and a specific set of blind spots, rather than any single, neutral, comprehensive account of the events themselves. The single most valuable source for Henry IV's own reign specifically is the extensive set of memoirs left behind by the Duke of Sully, Henry's own chief minister and closest personal confidant. Across the whole of the 11 years of peace this channel has described to you tonight, a source of enormous value precisely because Sully wrote from direct personal knowledge of the king's own financial and administrative reforms, but one that also, by the candid acknowledgement of nearly every modern historian who has used it, reflects Sully's own considerable personal investment in presenting both his own specific policies and his own beloved former master in the most flattering possible light. A bias worth remembering every time this same source is cited as evidence of Henry's own specific personal virtues. For the court of Louis XIV specifically, this channel and most modern historians of the period rely heavily on the extraordinarily detailed memoirs of the Duke of Saint-Simon, a minor courtier who spent decades of his own life observing the elaborate ritual and the elaborate court politics of Versailles from close personal proximity, producing an account of enormous anecdotal richness and enormous psychological insight into the specific personalities of Louis's own court, but one that also, by Saint-Simon's own frequently acknowledged personal grievances against specific rivals and specific policies he felt had unjustly slighted his own family's own status, carries a distinct and occasionally quite sharp personal edge that a careful modern reader has to weigh against the memoirist's own considerable literary gifts. For the War of the Spanish Succession and the subsequent extension of Bourbon power into Italy, this channel draws on the considerable body of surviving diplomatic correspondence between the various European courts involved, correspondence that, precisely because it was written by professional diplomats for the private consumption of their own home governments rather than for any eventual public audience, tends to offer a considerably more candid and a considerably less flattering assessment of figures like Elizabeth Farnese and Philip V than either monarch's own official court chroniclers were ever inclined to produce, a genuinely valuable corrective. This channel has tried to weigh carefully against the specific national and dynastic biases each individual diplomat inevitably carried into his own private reports home. It is worth pausing too on a considerably more informal but genuinely valuable source for the specific texture of daily life at Louis XIV's own court, because the extensive private letters of Madame de Sévigné, a noble woman who corresponded across several decades with her own absent daughter about the specific gossip, scandal and daily rhythm of Versailles, offer modern historians a window into court life considerably less formal, and considerably less concerned with settling old political scores than either Saint-Simon's memoirs or the kingdom's own official records, a source whose own casual conversational intimacy this channel has found genuinely useful in reconstructing the specific human atmosphere behind so many of the more purely political events this whole story has described to you tonight. It is worth pausing, finally, on the specific archival record this channel has drawn on for the Spanish and Neapolitan branches of this same story, because the surviving correspondence between the Spanish and French courts throughout Elizabeth France's own long campaign for her sons' thrones, preserved in the diplomatic archives of several European states, allows modern historians to trace her own specific strategic thinking, with a clarity the more polished and more retrospective court chronicles of either kingdom rarely provide. While the administrative records of Charles III's own long reign in Naples, including the detailed reports of the excavations at Herculaneum and Pompeii this channel has already described to you tonight, survive in unusually complete form, precisely because Charles himself took such close and well-documented personal interest in both projects, a specific case, worth naming plainly, where a monarch's own personal enthusiasm actually left modern historians a richer and more detailed record than a great many considerably more consequential political events in this same story ever received. A final accounting for everyone this story could not properly name. It is worth pausing one last time before we let this whole night rest on everyone this story has already told you it could not fully account for, because a fair telling owes its own listener that final honest reckoning before it allows itself to close. We do not know how many ordinary Huguenot families died of simple starvation behind the walls of La Rochelle during Richelieu's own 14-month blockade, only that the city's own population fell by more than half across the course of that same siege. We do not know how many ordinary French conscripts died in the Flemish mud during Louis XIV's own 5 decades of near-continuous warfare, fighting over dynastic disputes they had no realistic say whatsoever in choosing, only that the total human cost of those same wars, added together with the wars of religion and the 30 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession and the 7 Years' War, this whole story has described to you tonight very plausibly exceeds 10 million individual human lives. We do not know the name of a single ordinary Catalan defender who died in the final storming of Barcelona in 1714, only that the city's own fall still shapes, to this day, a specific regional memory of grievance this channel has tried to name honestly, rather than pass over in the interest of a tidier and more triumphant dynastic story. We do not know, with any real precision, how many of the 200,000 Huguenots driven into exile by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes actually survived the journey to whatever foreign refuge eventually received them, only that their own departure represented a genuine and lasting loss to the kingdom that had once, under this same family's own founding king, promised them a permanent home. It is worth pausing too on how strange and how oddly consoling it can be at this hour of the night to sit for a moment with just how completely most of the individual human cost behind this vast and glittering dynastic story has actually vanished from any specific and nameable record. How few of the millions who marched and starved and fought and drowned and bled out slowly on some nameless battlefield across 2 centuries of this family's own rise, left behind anything at all beyond their own bare and largely anonymous participation in a total that a handful of memoirists and diplomats, writing from the comfortable remove of a royal court or a foreign embassy, thought worth setting down as a single approximate figure. It is worth remembering gently that this is true of nearly everyone who has ever lived in every century, including, in the fullness of time, every single one of us listening to this story tonight, that the overwhelming majority of any human life, however full of its own private hopes and private griefs and private acts of courage or cowardice, is never actually recorded by anyone at all, is carried instead only in the memory of the small handful of people who happened to love that particular person while they were alive to be loved, and then, in time, is not carried any further than that. There is something almost restful in that thought, if you let yourself sit with it in the particular quiet of this specific hour, a reminder that the weight of being remembered, or of being forgotten, was never actually the measure of whether a single one of those lives mattered while it was being lived. It is worth pausing too on the specific and quieter kind of courage this story has shown you, scattered here and there among all of its considerably louder wars and considerably grander coronations, because it would be a disservice to end a story this heavy with royal ambition without also naming, one final time, the moments inside it that deserve to be remembered as something other than the ordinary machinery of dynastic power. A young Protestant king surviving a massacre through nothing more than his own quick and unsentimental thinking, and going on, decades later, to extend a genuine and lasting measure of protection to the very faith he'd been forced to publicly abandon. A besieged city's own ordinary residents choosing to starve rather than surrender their own faith and their own fortified independence to a cardinal's own patient siege engines. An old and dying king in Madrid, his own body failing him in nearly every way 3 centuries of deliberate royal inbreeding could fail a man, making in the final weeks of his own painful decline a considered and genuinely thoughtful decision about the future integrity of an empire he would not live to see either preserved or divided. A queen managing with real and largely unrecognised patience the daily governance of an entire kingdom around her own husband's own recurring and genuinely debilitating depression, asking no credit for it beyond whatever quiet satisfaction 2 sovereign crowns eventually secured for her own sons could privately provide her. It is worth pausing finally on the specific and durable comfort this channel always tries to leave you with. At this hour, once a story this large and this sprawling has finally been told all the way to its own end. Because the honest lesson of tonight's story is not, in the end, a lesson about the specific glamour of crowns or the specific machinery of royal succession. It is a lesson about scale and about proportion. The same lesson this channel has tried to offer you at the close of every difficult story it has ever told, which is that the ambitions of history, however towering and however permanent they must have felt to the people actually building them. A Sun King convinced his own palace and his own dynasty would last forever. A mother convinced that securing one more crown for one more son was the single most important task remaining to her in this world, were nonetheless, in the end, only ever one family's own passing accumulation of privilege and power, purchased at a cost this channel has tried honestly to name tonight, and destined, like every other human accumulation this channel has ever described to you, eventually to pass into the hands of new generations, new nations, and new arrangements of power. Those same builders could never have fully imagined. Whatever is pressing on you tonight, whatever private ambition or private disappointment has followed you into this bed and into this quiet room, it too is smaller, in the end, than 4 crowns held by a single family, smaller than a palace built specifically to control an entire kingdom's own nobility, smaller than a river of inheritance that once watered half a continent, and would, in its own fullness of time, run dry all the same. The world absorbed all of that, in time, and carried on, and it will absorb whatever you are carrying tonight in exactly the same slow and patient way, long enough for you to close your own eyes and rest. That brings us to the end of our story. It is worth pausing one final time on how strange it feels to sit with a story this large. A mountain kingdom's own Protestant prince, a cardinal's own patient dismantling of an entire nobility, a dying king's own final testament, a mother's own 3-decade campaign for crowns that were never legally hers to give, and to realise that the whole of it, sifted and weighed and told across everything we have shared together tonight, comes down, in the end, to the same handful of very human truths. This channel keeps rediscovering in story after story that ambition and survival are so often indistinguishable from one another in the moment they are actually being lived, that the grandest dynastic designs are assembled, after the fact, out of decisions that felt, at the time, considerably smaller and considerably more improvised than the finished portrait ever admits, and that the line between a family's own genuine achievement and a family's own genuine cost is worn thinner by every single retelling, until what actually happened, and what a later, grander legend needed to have happened, become almost impossible to fully separate from one another, and yet somehow, still, worth trying to separate anyway, one patient, careful telling at a time. Thank you, as always, for spending these hours with me tonight, for letting an old and sprawling dynastic story keep you company through the dark, and for trusting this channel to tell it to you honestly, with all its genuine achievement and all its genuine cost left intact, rather than smoothed away into something simpler and less true. If tonight's story kept you company the way we hope it did, consider leaving a like, and if you feel like it, letting us know down in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now, so that this small, quiet corner of the internet can go on holding, in its own modest way, A little map of all the different places where someone was awake tonight, listening to the same slow story, at the same time as you. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of this whole long night, the marriages, the massacres, the patient decades of maternal ambition, the small, unlooked-for kindnesses scattered here and there inside all of it, settle gently, and then loosen, and then drift away entirely, the way a river finally does, however far it once carried, once it reaches, at last, the wide and quiet sea. Good night, and sweet dreams.